Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Focus Group podcast. I'm Sarah Longwell, publisher of the Bulwark, and this is our last episode before Election Day. And so we've got a very special episode for you today. It is a twist on the Focus Group. Instead of talking to a group of voters, I'm going to have 4 conversations with some of the nerdiest political nerds I could find to talk to me about the most important dynamics of Tuesday's election. We're going to start by checking in on what is happening in the crucial swing state of Nevada by welcoming back to the pod John Ralston, the Dean of the Nevada Press Corps. John, thank you for being here again.
Sarah, it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to just say really quickly, some people, like my stepdaughter, doesn't like being called a nerd. I love it.
Oh, that's the highest compliment I can pay.
I know that.
And I got to tell you, from one political nerd to another, I am following you like a psychopath. I'm reading every word of your blog where you are breaking down the mail returns. And I appreciate that you try to tell us we still don't know anything, but every kernel, every crumb for people like us, I think, we can't help ourselves. So I'm just going to set this up really quickly, and then I want to get into what you're seeing in the early vote count there. So the governor and Senate race in Nevada, they're just both nail biters. And as we discussed last time, all of the ills of the last couple of years, inflation, COVID, crime, they hit Nevada especially hard. And Nevada is also the ground zero for the Hispanic voter shift toward the GOP. And then you've also got this insane Secretary of State candidate that I know you have strong feelings about, but you have been tracking these early votes. Can you just explain how this works in your state? What is it that you're getting? I understand there's mail coming in, but how are you getting this data?
Well, it's a really good question. And it goes to the heart of why, a lot of analysts this time of year say, don't pay attention to the early vote. It doesn't mean that much. It's not that predictive, but it is in Nevada. And since I've been tracking this like the political nerd that I am for a decade and a half, Sarah, there are daily reports of who has voted. And when I say who has voted, I mean the party and their name. I'm not really interested in the names, but I am interested in the party because it's pretty predictive in Nevada of what the actual vote will look like. And if you consider that in a normal year, 2/3 of the vote is cast before Election Day, you can model certain things off of that and you can make predictions off of that. I wish that were the case this year, by the way, Sarah. This is the hardest year since I've started doing this to predict, at least not yet, what's going to happen.
And is it because you just can't tell which way the indies are going to go? What is it that's making it so hard to predict, particularly this year?
I'm never completely sure which way indies are going to go or who the indies are in this cycle compared to other cycles. But that's only part of the problem. As you know, Nevada just instituted universal mail ballots to everybody in 2020 because of the pandemic. And then the Democratic-controlled legislature voted to keep it that way. And so the only parallel that we have in terms of voting patterns with a lot of mail is 2020. And there is not a lot of mail this time. Now, I expected there to be less, right? It's not a presidential year, but it's coming in very erratically and very slowly. And most of the people I talked to, and I came to this conclusion myself, Sarah, is I thought the turnout would be some pretty high fraction of 2020, where it was about 80%. I thought it might be as high as 70% or at least in the mid 60s. And now it looks like we may not even get to 60% because there seems to be less mail and people seem to be unclear about why. That is it a post office issue? Is there a backlog? People aren't sure, although I think it's the former, not the latter.
You think it's a post office issue?
I do because, I have good relationships with the people who are counting these in the county here in Clark County, where 70% of the vote is. And they say they're processing everything they get every day. And the numbers are just astronomically lower than they were in 2020. I mean, not just from a presidential year to a midterm year, but just a huge drop off. And by the way, that is a problem for the Democrats who are dominating the mail every time it comes in by almost a 2-to-1 margin, while the Republicans are winning the early vote, the in-person vote, by a somewhat less margin, but the turnout there is more robust.
Is it possible Did maybe just people aren't using as much mail because the pandemic's not a thing as much, and they're gonna go vote on election day, or they're voting in person?
I wish I could give you a definitive answer to it. And as you know, around this time of year, not only do we as political nerds want to have definitive answers, but the people who read us or listen to us say, come on, just tell me who's going to win. I don't know the answer to that question. There's a lot of speculation about election day turnout. Let me just tell you the figure from 2020, the first year that we had mail balloting here. 11% only turned out on election day of the total electorate that voted in 2020. And Republicans did very well on election day, as they generally do. There is some thought, and I think by Democrats, hope that Democrats, because there isn't a pandemic, as you said, are going to go back to voting in person. And a lot of people do like to vote on election day. I have to tell you, my gut tells me that's not what's going to happen, Sarah, but I wouldn't say definitively it's not.
Well, why does your gut think that?
Because it seems to me that all the winds are blowing against the Democrats here. And the
Yeah.
machine that the Democrats have erected here, which is the best in the country, probably has been doing everything it can with the help of the Culinary Union, which I'll remind your listeners is the biggest union in the state, has 60,000 members, half of them are more Hispanic, has been working really, really hard to get the vote out. And I just don't think any of that is geared toward a big election day turnout. And I think more Republicans want to vote on election day than Democrats. Now, again, I have said this many times too, and I hate to sound like the man with caveats, but this is an apple year and all the rest have been oranges that I've covered.
Just to go back to your thing about the post office, though, is what you're saying they're just being so slow with the mail? Because I saw this on your blog. Suddenly the mailman came and there was this big influx of mail. Is it possible that that could continue to happen and they just come in like more janky than they usually do?
I think janky is the most accurate scientific word to describe it, Sarah, because it has been very erratic this time compared to the predictability of 2020 with the mail balloting. And I can tell you, I don't know of a person on either side and smart strategist on either side who isn't surprised at either the erratic mail returns or the volume being so far down. Most people thought there would be about 1.1 million voters turning out in Nevada out of the 1.8 million registered. I wouldn't be surprised if it's down to a million or maybe even a little less, and that's in the 60% range. But here's the thing, we have to remember this, and this is what the Democrats are hoping for, is that the mail can continue to come in until 4 days after the election, as long as it's postmarked by November 8th. Now, that's good for the Democrats. It may be bad in the sense that if these races are very close, as you and I have been talking about, and the Republicans are slightly ahead on election night, and then mail starts to come in, you can imagine what that's going to look like.
So when you're talking to Democrats there, are they losing their minds? What's the vibe?
If you just went by Twitter, well, which no one should ever do, yes, they're losing their minds. But so the more experienced ones are more like, John, don't write our obit yet. We're in the game. And I think that's the best description. They only have about a 1.5 lead statewide in the ballots return, which is low for the so-called Reid machine here. But that organization still exists, and it's tilted very much toward mail return. So that is why I think they're puzzled and hopeful that the mail will stop its janky pattern and pick up a more regular pattern starting very soon.
And can you just explain to the listeners, because I've been finding it pretty interesting, you talk about it in terms of like Democrats need to build a wall to kind of come up against like the rural votes and then the in-person. Can you explain both the geography and how you're thinking about that firewall? What does that mean?
John, can you please nerd out for a few minutes? Well, if you insist, Sarah. So Nevada, as I've talked before, is essentially 3 states, with Clark County, Las Vegas having 70% of the vote, Washoe County or Reno, the other urban area, having about 18% of the vote. And then the rest is in the 15 rural counties, which are all deep red. What the Democratic machine has been able to do successfully in every cycle, at least since 2008, with only one exception, that was 2014, is build what I call a firewall in Clark County of banked Democratic votes. And they have such a big lead of predictable Democratic voters by election day that you can't make up for it in either election day or the votes cast in the rest of the state, because there are so many more votes in Clark County than anywhere else. The issue this time is that there is not huge turnout in Clark County. Therefore, the Democratic lead is not that great. The firewall, which was 47,000 by the end of early voting in the last midterm, is only about 24,000 right now. So that is not a good sign for them.
Okay. Well, one of the things I really wanted to follow up with you on is the Secretary of State race, because I got to tell you, so in the sea of, I think, terrible candidates on the Republican side who are election deniers, Kerry Lake is looking very formidable in Arizona. Herschel Walker looks like he's going to be able to take that thing to a runoff. But one sort of bright spot, I think, is that at least in the polling, some of these really horrible Secretary of State candidates, Jim Marchant being one of them, but Mark Fincham, another one in Arizona, they're polling behind the governor's candidates, which is odd, right? It's like odd that people would even know anything about the Secretary of State race. How is the Secretary of State race looking to you?
I'll answer that question in a second, but since you did the lead in that you did, I want to make it clear to everyone listening that it is not partisan at all to suggest that some of these terrible candidates, and they're almost all on the Republican side, who are election deniers or conspiracy theorists or just plain kooky, it's dangerous to elect them to public office. I think if you're a Republican or Democrat or an independent, you should be really worried about that, especially considering what happened after 2020. I'm sorry to get up on my soapbox for a second there.
No, preach, brother.
So the bottom line is with Marchant. Marchant is all of those things. He's an election denier. He's a conspiracy theorist. He's a kook. I've said in many places that he's maybe the most dangerous person ever on a Nevada ballot. Listen, I have not seen a poll where he is losing, which is very disturbing to me. Now, there are a third of the voters undecided. They have finally, in the last few weeks, run some really good negative ads exposing him for who he is. But the real danger for people who are worried about election deniers here in the state, and we have more than just Marchant, is if there ends up being some kind of red wave in Nevada. Sarah, you and I listened to focus groups where nobody here knew what the Secretary of State did or who the candidates were. So if it's just partisan voting patterns taking over, Jim Marchant could get elected. Now, I think that's very worrisome.
Very worrisome. And I guess from all the early mail, you can't tell anything about Hispanics, or can you from the geography? Is there any way to tell?
You really can't tell that much. And there is a phenomenon in Nevada, which may or may not exist elsewhere, where Hispanics tend to decide late. At least a significant percentage of Hispanics tend to decide late. Now, in the Senate race, Catherine Cortez Masto, who has not worn her heritage on her sleeve, has changed what she wears on her sleeves during the election cycle, which may or may not be a coincidence. And they are making direct appeals. The Republicans also, though, have spent more money than I've ever seen trying to get Hispanics to move away from the Democratic Party. I've seen a lot of polling on this, Sarah. Some of it shows Catherine Cortez Masto underperforming with Hispanics. And by underperforming with Hispanics, I mean significantly under 60%, which is, I think, what she needs to get. But there's other more recent polling that indicates she may be hitting her marks there. But as far as the turnout, I just don't know.
Well, and this is where I thought that maybe Cisco Aguilar, who was running against Jim Marchant for Secretary of State, maybe people don't think this way. I was like, well, he's Hispanic. Will that help? Would that give him a little bit of an edge with Hispanic voters? Just like sheer looking at a name and saying, oh, that person's Hispanic. Or do you not see that happening?
Well, listen, even though it's said, when white people talk about how Hispanics vote, it's so patronizing to say that Hispanics vote for Hispanics. But it's true of every demographic group. There is a certain percentage who will use identity politics, and that's how they will vote. The problem, of course, with Cisco who is a perfectly reasonable candidate, is he has been virtually invisible to most voters. And so if they see a Hispanic surname when they go and fill out their ballot, are they more likely to vote for him? Certain percentage will be. Will it be enough? I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Talk to me about the governor's race. You've got Steve Sisolak, the Democratic incumbent. Joe Lombardo, the Republican, who I think, as we discussed last time, he's a bit of a denier, but he's mostly a secret normie. Like, he's playing MAGA, but he's like definitely one of the better Republicans out there, just a low bar. But you talked a lot the last time about Sisolak, there being some frustration with how he'd handled things like getting people their COVID money and things like that. How do you think that's shaping up?
Well, I think that the conventional wisdom on both sides, and there's good reason for it, Sarah, is that Sisolak is running behind Catherine Cortez Masto, and that Lombardo seems like a more reasonable choice to independent voters and maybe some crossover Democrats because they're so mad at Sisolak than Laxalt does to Catherine Cortez Masto. If you remember from those focus groups, every single one of those potential swing voters said they would vote against Laxalt, mostly because of his pro-life position, while there were about a third of them maybe who said they would consider voting for Lombardo because of what I refer to as the COVID hangover. And so I think Democrats are more worried about Sisolak than they are about Catherine Cortez Masto. They're worried about both, but I think the worry is much more acute about Sisolak because he's the governor, because he can be blamed for every ill in the state, and they've linked him to Biden too, fairly or not. And so I think he's probably in more trouble than Catherine Cortez Masto, although I wouldn't be surprised by any matrix in those two races, Sarah, whether both the Democrats lost, both the Democrats won, or 1-1.
Yeah, but can I ask, and this is my last question before we invite our next guest in to talk Arizona, but I would say people went from kind of being like, oh, Cortez Masto, she's done. Like, that's the seat that gets flipped, to now, like, weirdly, people are like slightly more bullish on her and they're much more worried about, I don't know, Georgia, Pennsylvania, some of those other states. Does anything changed there?
Depends what people you're referring to. I hear people on both
I
sides
guess
of
I
that.
would say conventional wisdom,
Yeah, yeah.
politicos. I've heard a lot more people say they think she's going to hold on than were saying it 4 months ago.
I think that's certainly true. And I think it's because, and again, you hear this from Republicans who know what's going on as well. She has run a really, really good campaign. Her media has been sharp. She has been ubiquitous, including in the Hispanic community over the last couple of weeks or month. And so that if she can hang on, it's because of her work ethic. And I talked about her being a workhorse, not a show horse, and because her media has been so good.
John Ralston, Nevada, it is such an important state. I wish you guys were not on the West Coast. You're going to be behind. It's going to take forever to know what's going on. Actually, I'm sorry. Do you guys get to open the mail early? Like Pennsylvania, they don't do it and it could take forever. What's your counting going to be like? Like, when do you think you'll have results?
They will open all the mail and the early vote, hopefully relatively early on election night for those of us who live on the best coast as opposed to where others might live, Sarah.
Sure.
I would guess that we'll have most of the early vote in and posted by about midnight, maybe earlier. And I have to say, you will know a lot then. And if people want to know what to look for, look at those margins in Clark County. And if Catherine Cortez Masto does not have close to a double-digit lead in Clark County, she's in big trouble.
Okay, I just wrote that down. Double-digit lead in Clark County. John Ralston, for real this time. Thank you so much for coming on again. It's great to talk to you. Good luck with the next few days. I know they're going to be madness.
Thanks. I always enjoy it, Sarah.
See you, man. That was an awesome conversation with John Ralston, and I want you guys to all go check out his blog where he is tracking all of this stuff. It is the NevadaIndependent.com. Go check it out and follow his mail returns. Okay, next up, we are going to Arizona. Now, just like in Nevada, all the races there are tight, and the governor and secretary of state races are the races that keep me up at night. And Arizona also has some weird stuff going on, like armed vigilantes watching ballot drop boxes. So I went and found the smartest, most knowledgeable person I could on Arizona, Bram Resnick, the host of Sunday Square Off on KPNX in Phoenix. Bram, my man, thank you for being here.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I had been pronouncing your name Bram, and my team told me that I have been saying it wrong.
That's not unusual. You'll often hear politicians call me Bram because they think it bugs me, but I get it. It's something you live with the name Bram.
So speaking of politicians that you get into things with, so you and I met when I was out in Arizona, and then I saw you go viral. You were kind of mixing it up with Carrie Lake, the scariest governor candidate in the country, when you were giving her, a tough time about not answering questions. Just as a setup, you're the political guy out there. You are the face of sort of the political Sunday show. Just tell our listeners like what it's been like to cover these races this cycle.
We've never faced a challenge like this. And I want to say there are a lot of really talented political reporters in this town, and I'm really lucky to work with them because to some extent we've been support group for each other. In fact, late last night, one of them was walking up my street as I was walking my dogs. We ended up talking for an hour. So it's a really good group of people. It's a small place in a lot of ways. So you get to know people pretty well and see them often. What's it been like? Well, I'll put it to you this way. During the primary election, when I was on air reporting on the results of the Republican primary back in August, I said, Karen Taylor Robeson, she was the challenger to Carrie Lake. She wins, you get 4 more years of Doug Ducey. If Carrie Lake wins, you get 4 years of Donald Trump. And so far, that's proved correct. She is like Donald Trump in virtually every aspect. She is a COVID denier. She is an election denier. But at the same time, she has the gifts of a longtime TV anchor as a presenter, as a politician. She is, I think, one of the most charismatic politicians on the stage today. She is also a pugilist. You've heard her attack the media. Her favorite reporter, or favored reporter, is somebody who works for the Gateway Pundit. I probably shouldn't even call him a reporter, but that's Carrie Lake's idea of news. She says it and you repeat it. And so that's been a challenge for us as journalists. And we've never seen anything like it, not just as journalists, but as news organizations. How do you cover this?
And how do you cover it?
Well, it's challenging. You kind of have to pick your spot. She won't do a one-on-one interview with me. Early on, she created a viral video of me asking her questions. She claimed I didn't swear to the Pledge of Allegiance at an event, turned that into a viral video. And then several months later, I bought 2 ads on my TV show showing that viral video. I've never seen that before. Have you?
These are politicians and professional trolls.
Yeah, but I think what we face here in Arizona with the Trumpiest ticket in the country, I believe, the statewide ticket, has election deniers up and down. And what we have here, what we're dealing with here, is the same thing the national media has dealt with Donald Trump, is somebody who will just say things that aren't true. You've got to fact check them. What do you put on air? And especially when, as journalists, I said this when she put those ads on my show, we don't want to be the story, but she is making us the story. And so the question is, how do you push back without it appearing to be your feelings are being hurt?
Yeah, right.
We're all professionals. This is what you deal with and have dealt with for years, but not to this extent.
Since she was in the media for so long, she was a newscaster herself. Do you know her from that world?
Only really the way voters might, which is from watching her on TV. She was a newsreader for 25 years. I don't know of any journalist who thinks of her as a journalist. Since then, I knew of her, knew her reputation and that kind of thing, but never really had any kind of relationship with her. We also knew then the preceding 2 years or so, maybe 3 years, she had gone far to the right.
When you say her reputation, what do you mean?
This is based on what I am told by people who have served her in a bar, people who have dealt with her. She was the queen bee, and she was somebody who could be a tough person to deal with. I'll add that skit on Saturday Night Live came pretty close to the mark, sending back 2,000 salads. She thought she was in charge.
Okay, well, let's talk about these sort of individual races. And so Carrie Lake is running against Katie Hobbs, Secretary of State, and I have a couple questions related to Katie Hobbs. One is she sort of gambled on this idea that she wasn't going to debate. When I did the last focus group, and I talked about this when I went on your show, there was a couple people And at least one guy, he was going to vote for Kelly for Senate, but he was going to vote for Kari Lake because he was mad Katie Hobbs wouldn't debate. Do you think it was the right call for her not to debate? How do you think that's factoring in with voters?
In retrospect, it was a terrible call. This became, rather than having, say, one bad debate night with Kari Lake 2 months ago, this became a story that doesn't end. Even I think CNN was talking about it the other night. This story had legs. Her campaign certainly didn't anticipate, and frankly, those of us in the media didn't anticipate, but it just wouldn't end because Kari Lake helped it not end, and then Katie Hobbs then got an interview she wasn't supposed to get based on the agreement between the debate organizer and the debate broadcaster. So that was a whole other story. It's probably something she could have shook off, but it just came to fairly or unfairly define the campaign as someone who won't deal with the public all that much.
Why do you assume it would have been a bad night for Katie Hobbs? Like, she has tons of material to work with for offense. Like, you don't have to be a genius to be like, you won't say you're going to certify an election. Like, you have been lying to the voters. You would not engage in good governance. Like, I don't know. It just doesn't seem that hard. I understand Kari Lake is beautiful and charismatic and blah, blah, blah. But, like, make her look like the nut that she is.
Glad you brought that up. I'm not saying it would have been a bad night, but let's assume, worst case scenario, it's a bad night.
Yeah.
Right? You move on and find ways to deal with it. And from my reporting and the email exchanges I've seen between the Hobbs campaign and the debate organizer, it was clear she never was going to debate. They talked about trying to reach an agreement, and she wanted forums, a one-on-one forum. There is a way to debate a person like Kari Lake. Mark Kelly debated Blake Masters, who's a pretty aggressive debater and candidate himself. And it was a very structured debate, right? 60 seconds for Kelly, Blake Masters 45 to rebut, Kelly 45 to respond to Masters. What do people remember from that? Not much. And that's a debate Katie Hobbs could have had.
Yeah.
You know, Kirsten Sinema was kind of a model for this in 2018. She didn't even acknowledge her opponent. You just look straight at the camera and you say what you want to say. You don't engage. There is a way to do it. But again, Katie Hobbs never wanted to do it. You know, we know this. Katie Hobbs has been in politics here for about 10 years or so. She is not a great retail politician. One-on-one, you know, she's easy to talk to. But in terms of, you know, explaining positions, she's not somebody who's talented at that.
Yeah. The other thing, there's like a dust up in the state right now. They're trying to make Katie Hobbs, because she is the current Secretary of State, they want her to what? Not oversee the election, which is interesting because that's the whole thing that happened with Kemp and Stacey Abrams the first time, is he was Secretary of State and she accused him of taking people off voter rolls and whatnot. What do you think about this deal?
Look, Katie Hobbs or whoever is in that position swore an oath to do the job. I would assume that Katie Hobbs will uphold that oath. This is her job. We had a similar situation, I believe, back in 2014 when the then Secretary of State ran in the Republican primary for governor. I don't remember anybody asking him to excuse himself or recuse himself. Could be wrong. I don't remember that. Kari Lake has brought this up from time to time. It's the position Katie Hobbs is in. I think the irony is that if Kari Lake were in the same position, having to certify an election that she lost, what do you think she would do? And what do you think Katie Hobbs would do having to certify an election that she lost?
It's a great point because I mean, I can answer those questions.
Yeah.
Kari Lake would not certify it and Katie Hobbs will. And like, you just know that. So moving to the Senate race, you're right. I watched that debate between Kelly and Masters, and I thought Masters was like weirdly robotic. He was like a debate bot, but he was, you know, crisp and clear and whatnot. And Mark Kelly was fine. But I've been a little surprised. You know, Mark Kelly has led in every poll basically ever. It's one of those races that Republicans pulled out of at one point because they didn't see it as winnable. But he looks like he's closing strong in the way that all the Republicans seem to be closing strong. Do you feel like that's what's happening there? Or do you think, Kelly, that there's still a lot of people that are there to support him?
I do not make any predictions.
Just like vibes.
Vibes is how we're Yeah, the vibe. I don't think we'll ever know what quite is going on here. What I see is I see typical voter behavior. They start to make decisions.
Yeah.
And make choices, and maybe they had a feeling about somebody, a vibe about a candidate. But now, as it gets closer to decision time, they're making decisions. And I need to remind you, early ballots have been in voters' hands here for 3 weeks. So they are literally making decisions. I think 1 million ballots have been filed so far out of a projected 3 million or so. One thing I like to point out for folks who aren't that familiar with the environment here is in this midterm election, people know, I think, that Republicans have a registration advantage over Democrats here. But in a midterm election, you might see Republicans having an 8-point turnout advantage against Democrats. That's just the way midterms are. This one might be different. It looks like we're going to have a record turnout. It's a possibility. But in general, they have a turnout advantage. And so, if you're a Democrat and if you can win a race by 2 points, like Kirsten Sinema did in 2018 and Mark Kelly did in 2020, with the help of a lot of Republicans, say 10% of Republicans going your way, a differential of, say, 15 points on the independents, you have a chance of winning. But you're not going to win by 5 points or 8 points if you're a Democrat. So this kind of close race is what you would expect. And you could argue that, look, given the headwinds the Democrats face here, Phoenix has the highest inflation rate in the country. Those are pretty stiff headwinds, and yet they're neck and neck. We have a conservative columnist here who I respect, Bob Robb, longtime columnist, who says, you know what? If this weren't a Trump ticket, Republicans might be up by 5 points across the board.
Oh, 100%. Just the fundamentals favor Republicans in such an unbelievable way. The reason that Democrats are competitive in so many of these places is because of the candidate quality. We've done a bunch of focus groups in Arizona with swing voters, and I would say there wasn't a lot of love for Masters, generally. People thought he was weird and disliked him. But do you think people have been warming up to him? Has he been running a decent campaign? He's one of the guys who kind of scrubbed Trump from his website, changed his position on abortion. He did try to pivot.
Yeah.
So do you think he's done that successfully?
He's been campaigning more with Kari Lake, who was doing better than he was. Maybe there's a halo effect there. You've talked about negative partisanship, lesser of two evils. I think what you've seen on the Democratic side, and Obama, who was here, he just emphasized democracy. Is democracy an issue you can win with? A colleague who's a pollster here and says Democrats are just not presenting this issue in the right way. People get $5 a gallon gas, but capital D democracy, tougher to get. If you talk about your right to vote, the next election, what could happen if, say, a Governor Kari Lake and a Republican legislature and a Secretary of State, Mark Finchem, went to work over the next 2 years on our election laws? If you put it in those terms, it might be more relatable to voters. There's still $5 a gallon gas and rent that's way beyond many people's means, and grocery prices that are too high. That's a real fact they deal with every day. Maybe democracy would be more relatable if presented in that way, but it's not. And so it does fall back to those issues that everybody feels. Every voter feels it.
Yeah.
And so that has to be a significant thing when it comes to making a decision.
It's true. Here's a question, though. I'm pretty interested in sort of when we're going to get results from different places. But in Arizona, there's a weird thing happening with hand counting. You can tell me if I've got this wrong, but there's a couple of counties or towns that are saying they want to be able to hand count, and that is going to make things take forever. Everything seeps in when it takes longer. That's when the conspiracy theories start to breed. Yeah. What's happening?
Yeah, so let's break this down. So the hand count is set to be done in Cochise County. It's a southern Arizona county. There are about 60,000 votes there in an election. So, pretty sparsely populated county. Trump won it by, I believe, 20 points, 60-40 over Biden. It is a 3-person county board, 1 Democrat, 2 Republicans who are hardcore election deniers, and they want a hand count. And it's all about keeping alive the idea that you can't trust the election. They don't seem to know what they're doing. They don't seem to understand how long this will take, but I'm not sure they care. As for who's behind it, we know the local Republican Party chair, who was one of the 11 fake electors. He's involved, as is one member of the county board who was at the January 6th insurrection, another member who's also a pretty far-right Republican. Right now, it's isolated to one county, small county, could be kind of a demonstration they're thinking of, but it does appear aimed at just in some way undermining faith in the election. They say it's about restoring faith. I guess we'll see when you look at the characters involved. You do have to wonder about the motives. Now, your question about results, very good question. Our elections changed dramatically in 2020, not for the reasons people might think, because Republican behavior changed dramatically. Because of, at the urging of Donald Trump, not to trust early ballots, they showed up at vote centers on election day with early ballots. If you show up on election day, those ballots don't get counted immediately. They'll be counted the next day or the day after, because there's a process that early ballots go through. The majority of early ballots will be counted by this Sunday night here in Maricopa County, but there's still going to be a few 100,000 that aren't. And right now, I can tell you, our elections officials are concerned. If you look at the turnout, there's somebody here who tracks turnout daily. Republican turnout is behind Democratic turnout as we head into the weekend. There is a concern that once again, you're going to see a large number of Republicans showing up on Election Day, Tuesday, to either hand in their early ballots or fill in a ballot on the spot. They're concerned about scenes of lines outside polling places that will be, again, misinterpreted as problems when they're not problems. It's a different kind of voter behavior, Republican behavior, that's affecting the ballot count. So there will be ballots uncounted at midnight on Tuesday. There may be some races that aren't decided yet. It's quite likely there'll be some races that aren't decided yet. And that could go on for a couple days. But they are counting the ballots the way they always count the ballots, following the rules and the procedures laid out in all that. But people might be left with the impression that, it's not working, there are problems. But I would urge people who might be seeing these videos, if it happens, I want to add that, I'm not saying it will, but it looks like we're setting up for that. You know the story. I'll add one more thing. And this was a new law that came about after Donald Trump's narrow defeat here in Arizona. The threshold for recounts, automatic recounts, has been lowered to 15,000 votes. That's actually, given how close our elections can be in 2020, 5 of the elections, if this law had been in place, there would have been an automatic recount in 5 of the elections. One of those elections was the presidential election. And so it is possible we will see recounts in races, which will delay the final results, possibly into mid-December or maybe even Christmas.
Oh my God, what a nightmare. All right, so last question. Secretary of State race. Mark Fincham, one of the scariest people running for Secretary of State, and there's a lot of scary people running for Secretary of State. But one thing that's cheered me up is that I have seen him polling behind his challenger, Adrian Fontes, and also behind Kari Lake. Like, he doesn't seem to be doing as well. And people are actually spending money in that race to define him. Yep. What do you think? What's going on there?
There's going to be some fascinating ticket splitting on Tuesday, isn't there?
Yeah, right? You think?
You might vote for Kari Lake for governor, but vote for Adrian Fontes for Secretary of State? Yeah, I mean, wow. You could see a Kelly Lake Fontes vote. Just bizarre.
And do you think that's because there's been a concerted effort to define Fincham?
He has faced an onslaught of advertising. And he has been pretty well defined. And frankly, if you see him online or in videos, he's defining himself. He is probably the most hardcore election denier in the bunch. He worked on it. November 30th, 2020, he convened this event at the downtown hotel with Rudy Giuliani and some of the best known election deniers to just push this forward, to keep the doubt alive. And he is still that way.
Bram, my man, thank you so much for being with us today, for breaking down Arizona. It is the state I am most deeply concerned about, and we may have to talk about it again
All right.
after the election. So thanks for being here.
Sure thing. Stay in touch.
Thanks to Bram Resnick for stopping by. Now, along with some last-minute predictions, I wanted to explore the potential fallout from these midterms in 2023 and 2024. And for that, I wanted to bring in the guy who's an even bigger optimist than I am, Mr. Bill Kristol, my good friend. Hey, Bill.
I'm not usually introduced that way, and I'm not usually that optimistic, but I'm happy to play that role here. And I am actually slightly more optimistic than the conventional wisdom about Tuesday. So good to be with you anyway. Right.
I mean, you and I talk like every day, and I would say through this, I've been trying to tell everybody like mixed bag. There's some bright spots, whatever. I feel like you have even been more bullish in this tough environment than anybody. Maybe that's a misread, but where are you? Where so this will play on Saturday, so we're just like 3 days out. Where are we?
I mean, so actually one reason I was bullish, or at least not so super bearish, very early on in 2022, and everyone else, people forget this now, was red wave, red tsunami, oh my God, 2010 or 1994 all over again. And I said I just didn't see it in the data, and there were other reasons to think that might not happen. And you and I think agreed that one reason was the extremism of some of the Republican nominees as they emerged through 2022. And then, of course, the polls changed after Dobbs. I also would mention that Roe could be overturned. And the polls changed in the summer, and I thought it's a rare phenomenon for me. I was sort of right about this, and right a little bit ahead of other people, that it wasn't going to be a red wave. Then the polls reversed some in September, October, and I sort of maybe am stubbornly sticking to the non-red wave thesis a little more than I should, though I don't know. The polls now are very mixed. And my take on where we are is very close races and very hard to predict. And we don't know what turnout model is right. Is there a hidden Trump turnout as there was in 2020, hidden Republican turnout? Is there somewhat hidden Democratic turnout? The polls have been off at every election. They've been off half the time in undercounting Republicans and half the time Democrats. Everyone's so freaked out by 2016 and 2020 that we're more cognizant of the undercounting of Republicans. I would still bet on the Senate staying Democratic. I just think Democrats are going to be okay in Arizona and probably Georgia and win Pennsylvania, which means they could lose Nevada. And I think Ohio is very much in play. And then these other states aren't totally out of play for a Democratic pickup, actually, a couple or two of them. So I tend to think a Democratic Senate. I do think Republicans almost certainly now win the House. And I think what's happening, this is sort of a political sciencey point, but I think an interesting one for 20 seconds. The Trumpy parts of blue states are becoming more Trumpy. So parts of New York, parts of California, parts of Washington and Oregon that have, demographics resembling, let's say, central Pennsylvania, the place that you know well. They were sort of held back from going the way Pennsylvania and Ohio went because they're like in such blue states, if you're in New York. But at the end of the day, if you just do the kind of very 30,000 foot look at some of these districts, they look a little bit like districts that have gone Republican and Trumpy in the Midwest and elsewhere. And so there are House seat pickups possible for Republicans. In the Senate races, on the other hand, there are a heck of a lot of young and diverse voters in Atlanta and suburban female voters in the suburbs of Philadelphia as well as Pittsburgh. And there the dynamic, I think, is somewhat different. The Trump vote's already manifested itself, you might say, in states like that in 2016 and 2020. And I feel like the upside's a little more on the Democratic side if they can get a decent young voter turnout on election day. I think we could have slightly divergent results in the Senate and the House, slightly divergent results in different parts of the country. We've gotten so used to saying correctly that it's a nationalized election these days and polarization, and the old days when one state would go, 15 points Democratic and the neighboring state 15 points Republican. That doesn't happen that much anymore, but it could happen a little more than people expect. So I think we could have cross-cutting currents to some degree. And finally, on the governors and secretaries of state, which you've been following so closely, I'll just ask you this. Those, I think, are very hard to read, but a little better for Democrats than one might have thought a few months ago, no?
Yeah, I think to the extent that when people talk about waves, the point about waves is that it sweeps all the things in its path, right? And that's why I've been like, the wave's not quite the right thing here, because I think, it's not going to sweep up a guy like Doug Mastriano, not just because he's a particularly bad Republican, but because the Democrat, Josh Shapiro, is a particularly good Democrat. The things that really stuck out in the focus groups were a lot of times, people are like lesser of two evils and I just voting against the worst person. People had a really positive opinion of Josh Shapiro in the swing voting groups, knew specific things that he'd done, knew who he was and just felt favorably about him. And I think we should look look at him as a potential emerging sort of Democrat star, especially if Oz either wins or comes very close, but like he beats Mastriano by 10 points or 7 points or something. Gretchen Whitmer, I know people are starting to get nervous about Michigan, and I understand why. They've had upsets there before, but I think she's sort of battled back from a place where people were kind of down on her, and I think things are looking good for her. Evers and Katie Hobbs, those people are kind of, and like Sisolak in Nevada, those things are much more on the knife's edge. But I do think that there's just going to be some of the Democrat governors that do just fine. Look, if you're looking through the lens like I am, which is sort of a democracy lens as opposed to like a partisan Democrat lens, the secretaries and state and governors races matter a great deal. And so I think they're just going to be more of a mixed bag. Obviously, the thing I'm scared about the most is Kari Lake.
Yeah, and the effect of that after the election. If some percentage of the candidates who are only running because Trump recruited them, supported them, helped them win the primary, and then if they win the general election, which I would say Kari Lake's basically in that category, Oz is in that category, Herschel Walker's in that category, the gubernatorial candidate in Wisconsin, Michaels, and they all had Trump support. Trump pulled them across the finish line in primaries against, in many cases, better established Republicans in their own states who were supported by the Republican establishment. So Trump truthfully could take credit for getting them the nomination. And then everyone said, oh, well, you got them the nomination, but I mean, they can't win the general election. What a suicide mission. And of course, our Democratic friends idiotically put money in to help some of those people, right, in the primaries. And if they win the general, the degree to which Trump gets to say, these people wouldn't be here without me, it would be not a false statement, right? And they won with me strongly supporting them and doing rallies for them. I think Trump's strength in the Republican Party becomes greater than it is if he's there with Kari Lake and Oz and Walker as winners 2 days after Election Day. It's a continuation of the world we've been living in, but maybe even an accentuation, don't you think, on the Republican side?
I do. I do think it intensifies something. So, like there's been lots of times where people really accentuate the divisions between the McConnell wing and Trump. And, everyone's always looking for that establishment MAGA fight. That stuff's over. Like Trump will have won definitively if he pulls all these guys over the finish line, and he will bounce into a 2024 nomination as a kingmaker. And the way that the world is the most different is just how many people owe their careers to him as he's running for office. Like they will all rush to endorse him. There will be no room for DeSantis or anybody else, right? Because Kari Lake will be the newly minted governor of Arizona. Trump will announce, as we're taping this on Friday, but everyone's got these scoops that Trump's looking like he's going to announce on November 14th. And so what? All those people, they all rush to endorse Trump, and it's basically over, right? Like who challenges him at that point?
I'll slightly be less, fatalistic. It's not quite over, but it strengthens them hugely. And people who are kidding themselves about how, we're having a meeting with Glenn Youngkin in 2 weeks, and he thinks there's a blame for him. I tend to agree very much that unless people fight back very hard, very fast, and this will be an interesting test. All these donors who are telling DeSantis privately, we like you better than Trump. You're more respectable. You can win. Trump could lose. Will they say 2 days after Election Day, I'm putting up millions of dollars for DeSantis? Or will they kind of slink away and, Ron, good luck. Let's be in touch in a few months. But I see how it plays out a little bit, right? I feel like you're totally right about Trump's strength. The other thing that's going to start happening is if you're an ambitious young politician or someone thinking of going into politics, Kari Lake wins, Michaels wins. What lesson do you learn? You learn that you should be like them. You learn that the most important thing you can do in a Republican primary, almost anywhere in the country, honestly, at this point, is have Trump's support. The second most important thing you can do is sound like a Trumpy, election-denying, conspiracy-fostering, bigoted nativist type, because that's the path to success. And so the degree to which this is a dynamic process. This is something you and I have always been struck by. I would say, honestly, other people tend to take a sort of snapshot view of this. They don't see that it's a movie, not a photograph, The degree of the increasing radicalization of the party, then. It's not just that Portman and Sass and Toomey leave the Senate and they're replaced by, if they win, the J.D. Vances and Dr. Oz's of the world who owe their careers to Trump. It's also that the people who run for the House next time and for the Senate next time and for state office next time are mini Kari Lakes and mini Michaelses in Wisconsin and so forth. So I think the dynamic is in a very bad direction if they win. If some of those people lose, if the Marist polls are right, if some of these Trump candidates lose and more of them lose than the non-Trumpy candidates, if there are non-Trumpy candidates much anymore, then that stems that somewhat. But all he needs, probably just from a media point of view, I mean, you're the expert on this, don't you think? Is, I mean, Lake is probably the biggest, right? I mean, if Lake wins, Oz will lose, whatever, and people will say, well, Fetterman was lieutenant governor and stuff. But if Carrie Lake beats the sitting secretary of state in Arizona, after the whole world had decided she was so far beyond the pale that she couldn't win, that's awfully big for Trump, I think.
It is. And, it's something I'm watching all the anti-antis already kind of line up, and they're doing this thing where they say, I mean, yeah, of course she's a crackpot, but man, is she talented. Boy, is she formidable. Listen to how she answered that question. Like, they're already setting themselves up just to fall all over themselves about her political acumen. Carrie Lake is a real game changer, not the least of which is she becomes kind of the Trump surrogate. Obviously, she becomes a vice presidential pick, but there's a lot of people auditioning for that job. A lot of women, Tulsi Gabbard, Nikki Haley, although that ship's probably sailed. I don't think DeSantis would do it, but I don't know. But the extent to which it just becomes a parlor game about Trump again, and everybody's talking about Trump, and Trump is on the top of everyone's mind. Like, I don't know. I just was on a secret pod with JBL talking about this, but what do you do? Like, what are the chances that the Republican National Committee just decides, yeah, who needs to have a race? Why have a divisive primary?
Right, or Pence and Christie and, Asa Hutchinson run, but actually DeSantis and Youngkin don't, and Pompeo doesn't, and Cotton doesn't, and suddenly it's a pretty one-sided race, I should think. I mean, on the Democratic side, since you mentioned, I think, a point that's really been neglected, which is they're pretty good Democratic candidates who are running and winning in some places. I mean, Shapiro in Pennsylvania, Tim Ryan, even if he loses by a point or two, and we don't know what will happen there, pretty impressive race. Will the Democrats have the wit to get these people together and say, okay, you guys have actually outperformed in very tough states. You guys know something about how to win in this universe we're living in America in 2022, 2023, 2024. Tell us what we need to be doing, or are the Democrats just going to be sort of oblivious and, I don't know, do whatever they do?
I mean, I think one of the main downsides to sort of rerunning Trump is that people think it is just that, a rerun. I think that Democrats should treat this as the existential threat that it is. This guy tried to stage a coup to stay in power last time. He will now have a ton of secretaries of state, governors, senators, and people in his corner that he didn't have last time, and not to mention all the state legislatures. All the people who held the line, with the exception of Brad Raffensperger, everybody who held the line is gone. Like, all these, like,
and Kemp in Georgia.
And Kemp in Georgia. I'm thinking, like, in the state legislatures.
Yeah, totally.
Those people are gone. And
Doug Ducey in Arizona, who was quite important.
That's right.
Let's not forget.
And so, to your point about how everybody's getting worse, and, like, Trump spawns a mini generation of mini Trumps, and then they themselves spawn a new generation of mini Carrie Lakes and mini Marjorie Taylor Greenes. We're in a very precarious situation. And so if the Democrats at that point don't take the lesson very hard and very seriously, and if Tim Ryan does come within 1 point, or he's the one place where I'm willing to be very bullish that Tim Ryan could potentially pull through and do an upset. But if he comes close, he should become the national face of the Democratic Party. Or a guy like Josh Shapiro is very impressive. So they've got to start thinking about that. I think they're insane to run Biden again, but there's lots of people who disagree with me on that.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. But even if they don't run, what I'm struck by when I talk to Democrats is there's not much of a sense that they could learn something from these candidates who will have radically outperformed in a tough environment with 8.5% inflation and an unpopular president. I mean, if Tim Ryan gets within, I think he could win, but let's say he gets within a point or two in Ohio where Biden's at 37% approval or something. And, the state's been very Trumpy the last two cycles. And the National Party hasn't spent much money on him, which is kind of unbelievable in my opinion. There's a lot to be learned from Tim Ryan. I just don't get the feeling that they don't think of it quite that way, though. For some reason, maybe they will. Maybe we can get them. We can get them to think that way. Maybe.
Well, I was going to say, you say politics is contingent, and I think that is the case. That if Democrats get defeated in major ways, they lose these Senate seats. There's got to be some reevaluation going into 2024, knowing they're facing Trump again. When you just said about something, we can do, I could get dour about what the possibility of people learning the lessons that need to be learned. But the fact is, a whole bunch of people are going to have to stand up and just say, it can't go on like this. Like, you have to become more politically popular. You have to change this conversation. Can't keep doing the same thing over and over again.
Right.
Anybody who's happy about the idea of rerunning against Trump because they think he's beatable, I think is playing a dangerous game.
Yeah, totally.
Bill, any last words here? Because I don't want to keep you too long.
the main lesson to be taken from 2022 is Trump's not going away. Trumpism isn't going away. It dominates the Republican Party, and the Republican Party is going to get 50%, maybe get 49, maybe 51%, right, of the vote around the country. Basically, it's very, very even. And so confidence that, oh man, they're really discrediting themselves. Can you believe these cookies theories they're spouting? Confidence that they're going to pay a price for that without making them pay a price, without having a democratic strategy and messaging operation and candidates who are capable of making them pay a price. That is the biggest mistake to make, whichever way these races that are on a knife edge go.
Bill Kristol, thanks for coming by to the Focus Group Pod, sharing your wisdom with us. We will see how things go. May the optimists always win.
I'm with you in that hope.
See ya.
See ya.
All right. Always fun to have a visit from my pal, Bill Kristol. But now I'm going to do a little point of personal privilege. There is a guy in my office. Sometimes I've mentioned him on the other podcasts. His name is Gunnar Raymer, and he started as an intern with me 18 months ago. He is deeply impressive, and he's one of these guys. He's like a young Steve Kornacki. We have whiteboards in our office, but he's the guy who sits with his head in all the polling. He has strong feelings about television advertising versus digital advertising, and he basically helps us set the strategy for a lot of the work we do in the actual races that we're playing in. And so I talk to him every day, but I wanted you to hear from him because he is somebody who is deep in the weeds on this stuff, and I thought it would be fun to talk to him. Gunnar, thanks for being here, man.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
Okay, so because we had Ralston and Resnick on, we've been focusing on the western states like Nevada and Arizona, but we haven't talked as much about Pennsylvania and Georgia. Why don't you give us an update on where both of those stand?
Yeah, so we can start with Pennsylvania. Listen, a Fox News poll had Josh Shapiro up double digits over Doug Mastriano. And we've seen it tighten a little bit. Republicans are coming home as they start to pay attention to the races. And Doug Mastriano's been able to do some small TV buys, but Josh Shapiro is in a very good position right now. And I'm not concerned on a democracy scale about the Pennsylvania gubernatorial race. However, if I was, working for John Fetterman's campaign, I would be concerned. I think pointing to our last PA focus group with these Oz leaners who saw the debate performance, I think that Republicans in a very real way are coming home to Dr. Oz. And it's not like you need 50% plus one, like in Georgia in the Pennsylvania Senate race. You just need a majority of votes. And I think that Oz has positioned himself as he's attempted to pivot and be more palatable to these swing voters. I think that it's worked because, again, these attacks, and it's ruthless attacks. It's very clear and obvious to voters when they hear the message from Senate Leadership Fund and other Republican outside groups hitting Fetterman on crime and inflation. And I think that we're seeing voters react to that negatively and coming home to Oz.
How come you think that did experiments on dogs stuff didn't do more damage?
Because it's confusing, right? It's easy when you can just say John Fetterman said this about cash bail or whatnot, and then it sticks. It's a very clear message. These people are being pummeled with ad over ad right now. And when you have a clear, consistent message coming from both Oz himself and outside groups, I think it makes it easier for voters to understand. And I think these wacky Oz hits that Democrats have on him isn't working outside of maybe the carpetbagger stuff. And to be clear, I think that there's a lot of people when they're taking a poll and say, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion about Dr. Oz? I think they say unfavorable. A lot of them do. A majority of them do. But I think that some of these unfavorable Oz voters are still saying, yes, I'm voting for Oz over Fetterman for two reasons, because I don't trust Fetterman on issues related to crime and inflation. And Dr. Oz isn't some crazy person like Doug Mastriano. These are traditional Republicans who like to check off a box and say, hey, I'm voting for one Republican. And it's definitely not Doug Mastriano for them.
All right. So, I agree with you on this because, again, we are in brain sharing mode. But what I've always kind of thought, if Fetterman pulls this out, it's going to be because a bunch of Trump voters vote for him. Because they are like Steel Town folks in Pittsburgh. It's not the college educated suburban voters that we normally talk to, the flippers, people who went for Trump in 16, Biden in 20. Those are college-educated suburban Republicans. They are right-leaning independents or moderate Republicans, and they can get comfortable with Oz. Don't you think there's going to be some subset of Mastriano Fetterman voters? Or I guess I've always thought that was going to be something that existed and that they could even potentially undercount those people because they do tend to chronically undercount these voters in the polls. So is that not a possibility?
I think that right after the primary, there was a lot of talk if this was possible. And I think that at that time it was possible, but I'm not sure John Fetterman ran the kind of campaign that he needs to. I understand that he naturally comes off as some sort of populist, but I look to Tim Ryan in Ohio, and I think he's done a much better job talking to these maybe traditional Democrats who went Obama, Obama, Trump, Trump. I think that someone like Tim Ryan has done a much better job of doing that than someone like John Fetterman. And Tim Ryan hasn't been hit on crime and inflation the same way that someone like John Fetterman has, just because of Fetterman's past comments. And I think before the primary, too, we talked about why the Fetterman candidacy was something that could not work out for Democrats. And we knew these hits were coming. And over the summer, I think people got a little bit too excited. And those that could sort of see SLF hits on Fetterman are coming, they're coming after Labor Day and they're really going to work. And that's what we're seeing. And that, I think, doesn't happen if Connor Lamb is the Democratic nominee. I think he's making the same exact pitch as Josh Shapiro is. And I think that the dynamics would be a lot different should he have been the Democratic nominee.
Yeah, pour one out for Connor Lamb, man. All right, let's talk about Georgia. Eric Erickson is really pushing the narrative like Herschel's got it locked up. Everyone came home. No one's mad about the just scandal after scandal, all the kids he didn't raise and the abortions he paid for, allegedly. And, it's not even going to a runoff. Walker's got it in the bag. What do you think?
I still think it goes to a runoff. I think Brian Kemp wins handedly over Stacey Abrams. And I think that you're going to have enough support for the Libertarian candidate, and you're going to have Walker sitting around 49, and I think Warnock a little bit under that, and that's going to be a runoff. But I guess, Sarah, my one question for you, and we've talked about this before, and it's who has the advantage if there is a runoff in the Senate race? How do you think about that?
Yeah, this one's fun to game out because, all right, so right now, Herschel Walker is no doubt going to get helped, just like Brad Raffensperger did in the primary, by the long tail of Brian Kemp. And that goes away in a runoff. Kemp's not on the ballot. A lot of traditional Republicans aren't turning out, or might not, That's a possibility. And that hurts Herschel Walker. I think it probably comes down to whether or not Republicans already have 51 seats in the Senate. Because if the Senate hangs in the balance like it did last time, I just think that the Republicans will spend more money than God to pick up that Senate seat. Like, if that's the only one, they will do anything they can to push Herschel Walker over the edge. So, I don't know. It's tough, though. Do you have a sense of this one?
Donald Trump gets very involved, I think, in this Senate runoff. And that wasn't the case in January of 2021. He was actively telling people that the election was rigged. And so long as Kemp avoids the runoff and it's just about Herschel Walker versus Raphael Warnock, I think Trump comes in heavy there. And he really helps with the rural vote in Georgia that didn't come out in the same way back in the runoff in 2021.
Yeah. It's hard to know, though. I mean, Georgia's been the one place that's kind of bucked Trump. I think that Herschel benefits more from Kemp because Kemp gives him the normie validation. I think Trump, when he gets real involved, I actually wonder how much that helps him. At that point, man, Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump will never have been on the same page so clearly as they would be fighting for Herschel Walker to get that Senate seat.
That's right.
Okay. Michigan governor's race.
I think Whitmer's going to be fine. There's been a little bit of panic, I think, with Michigan Democrats and seeing the Republicans come home. Yeah, there's been some outside spending. There's been debates between Whitmer and Dixon, and Republicans are coming home. And I think Whitmer is still in a fine position. And I think the further down ballot you go with these wacky Republican candidates, the Democrats are going to be just fine. I mean, with Christina Caramo, Michigan Secretary of State candidate, she has spent almost no money on television. Same with Matt DePerno. He spent some money. He's the Attorney General candidate in Michigan. But I do want to talk about what happened in Michigan that's a little bit different because everybody likes to pick on Republican primary voters, and they've made a lot of poor decisions this primary cycle. But Caramo and DePerno both got the GOP nomination at the convention, right? So delegates voted for them, and they beat the establishment picks. They beat elected officials handily. Christina Caramo, QAnon, says that abortions are satanic murder, all these crazy fringe podcast appearances, and she got 2/3 of the vote at the convention just because she was handpicked by Donald Trump. Same with DePerno. He beats a former House Speaker, Tom Leonard, easily in the convention. Just goes to speak that, there's a problem with Republican primary voters But there's also a problem with these conservative activists, too, who are shoveled through these crazy candidates. I mean, Matt DePerno is under investigation for tampering with election machines, right? And he easily won. And there's this recent study, I think about it all the time. And what it took a look at is conservative activists and how they perceive elected officials and how conservative they think they are. And what the study found is that no matter how conservative someone's voting record was, they were perceived as less conservative if they did not support Trump. Now, we know this with Republican primary voters. Liz Cheney, doesn't matter how much you talk about how much of the time she voted with Donald Trump, or Tom Rice in South Carolina, a very conservative member of Congress. If you don't support Trump, you're out with Republican primary voters. And I think this Michigan example is that not only at the Republican primary voter level are you out if you don't support Trump, but same with GOP activists. And we saw that in Michigan. I think it's a great example of that.
You haven't sort of burst on the scene of political punditry yet, but you will. But you're looking like deep at all these numbers because you're the one who helps us think about where and how we're going to spend our money. And so because you don't have the scourge of conventional wisdom constantly being thrust upon you, do you have any things that you think all the big shots are missing, that like all the things they talk about on the cable networks are just silly narratives or bad narratives, or they're missing the point, or there's something you've seen that people aren't talking about enough that's contributing to this political dynamic?
That's a great question. I don't know. I have one critique that I've seen a little bit, but it's a critique that others are making too. And it's the looking at the early vote as a guide to how the midterms are going to look, I think just doesn't make sense, because as we see realignment take place, we can see who voted so far in the midterms, but we don't know how they voted, right? It's hard to predict what the crossover support is. So the idea of looking at early vote and all of that as some sort of predictor, I think, is missed by some political pundits.
Yeah, these last few days right before the election are an actual nightmare because you desperately want answers. And so you're looking for anything you can find to give you some sense. But at the end of the day, nobody knows anything. Political punditry is a scam. Nobody should participate. All right, last question, Gunnar. Are there any upsets you think could happen? What are your outlier races where you think people would be like, oh my God, that's amazing?
Okay, I have a fun one for you. And I want to preface this with saying I do not think it's going to happen. But I would love if it happened. And that is this Oklahoma gubernatorial race, right? It's Joy Hoffmeister, who is an elected official statewide in Oklahoma. And she is mounting a very decent challenge against a really bad Republican governor, Kevin Stitt, who is pissed off the tribes in the state. Parents are mad that previously had to go to 4-day school days. And it would be absolutely great to have one of these former Republicans turn Democrat beat a really bad Republican. And I'd love that. But I wanted to ask you, Sarah, do you have any fun upsets that you're looking forward to?
I mean, I bet the farm on Tim Ryan here. Sure. There's two outlier races, right? One is New Hampshire with Don Bolduc, who is a total insane person, election denying lunatic.
Yep.
And then there's O'Day in Colorado, who's like a normie Republican from the old days and who has said that the election was free and fair, who doesn't want Donald Trump's endorsement. And I don't know, there's a part of me that would like to see someone like him do well while all the others fail. I want to see Walker go down, Masters go down, Vance go down. And if those guys went down, but suddenly there was an upset in Colorado, I would find that to be a good outcome because it would help with the narrative, even though we're still pushing a boulder uphill, that the insane people lose. And if you could nominate some decent people, they might win.
No, this is totally right. And what we should really hope for is Joe O'Day does very well, and Heidi Ganahl, who's the gubernatorial candidate going against Jared Polis, does poorly. Because the day after she won the Colorado primary, she's going on Steve Bannon's show. She doesn't call January 6th an insurrection. And it would send a signal that if you nominate a moderate Republican who's out on Trump, this is how you can perform. You can outperform the MAGA, terrible Republican candidates. And also Colorado has a Republican candidate who beat an absolute lunatic former county clerk named Tina Peters, and she won the Republican primary there in Colorado. So it's a very interesting state.
Yeah, they got a good Republican Secretary of State candidate in Colorado too. They've got a couple of good Republicans that it would be nice to see some of them do well in, as long as all the other ones lose, as long as the bad guys lose.
That's right.
Gunnar Raymer, thank you for coming and nerding out with me on the Focus Group podcast. And thanks to all of you This is our last focus group podcast before Election Day. We will be back a few more times before the end of the year to sort of do cleanup from these races, analysis, find out who our swing voters ultimately voted for. So there's going to be more focus groups in your future. I've gotten so much out of these focus groups the last few years, and I hope you have too. Remember to vote if you haven't already. Keep the faith. Thanks for listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Focus Group Podcast. I'm Sarah Longwell, publisher of The Bulwark, and this week we are going to indulge in a little 2024 talk. Now, I know what you're thinking. I said I was going to wrap up on the last election, and I promise you I am. But as you may have heard, Donald Trump announced that he is running to be president again in 2024. And I'm sorry, but I want to talk about that for a little bit. Because Republicans' lackluster midterm performance, especially among Trump's endorsed candidates in swing states, seemed to have sapped Trump's announcement of his typical dark electricity. I was actually a little bored. And instead, the guy getting all the buzz as a potential Trump challenger right now, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, is fresh off a 19-point re-election win in Florida, where he won Miami-Dade County by 11 points. Even as Republicans underperformed in most of the rest of the country. Now, over the past year, we've talked to a lot of Republican voters about their interest in Trump running again in 2024, as well as their interest in DeSantis and other potential GOP candidates. So we've pulled together a bunch of that sound to give you a sense of how Trump voters are thinking about the Republican Party's future. My guest today is David Drucker, author of In Trump's Shadow, The Battle for 2024 and the Future of the GOP, and he is a senior correspondent at the Washington Examiner. David, thank you so much for being here.
Good to be here, Sarah. Thank you.
So you're at the RJC, the Republican Jewish Coalition's meeting in Las Vegas right now, where there's a whole bunch of 2024 contenders in attendance. What are you seeing and hearing? Who's there? What's the vibe like?
Well, there was a big fundraising dinner last night. Of course, they don't let us into that. Glenn Youngkin was supposed to be the headliner. He had to back out because of that horrific shooting in Virginia. Larry Hogan spoke. Ronna McDaniel, the RNC chairman, spoke. And there are a number of Republicans who would like to be president that are going to be here over the next couple of days. And so I'm going to be talking to activists and donors active in the Republican Jewish Coalition, trying to get a bead on exactly how much appetite there is for the party to move on from Donald Trump. As you and I have discussed for a long time, and as your focus groups have proven, within the Republican base, there is still a lot of fidelity to Trump. The question is, coming out of the midterm elections, do Republicans get restless because it's been 3 elections in a row with disappointment? The midterm elections in 2018, you could toss out by saying, hey, this is what happens to presidents in their first term, although it didn't exactly happen to Joe Biden. But 2020 and 2022 are squarely on Trump's shoulders. And I've already detected more restlessness, more willingness to look elsewhere than ever before since Trump announced for president in 2015, the first time. But the question is whether, once all of the dust settles, this sentiment sticks around and continues to grow, or whether, as we saw after January 6, 2021, we get past the initial shock of it all, and then we realize that the Republican Party is still Trump's to run as long as he sees fit.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem, right? Which is, at this point, I keep trying to say this to people, that we've learned so much over the last 7 years. One of the lessons that we've learned is that no matter what Trump does, he seems to survive it. He incited an insurrection. He refused to engage in a peaceful transfer of power. He went to Helsinki and stood next to Vladimir Putin and sided against America's intelligence community. He was caught on camera talking vulgarly about sexually assaulting women. And every time it looks like he's done, he's not. And so we have learned that lesson. But we've learned what the vibe of that is like. The vibe of him coming back and not getting sort of taken down by it. And what feels different about this, it's not just the way people were reacting to him, it's him. Like his speech announcing his candidacy for 2024, both strategically was very poorly timed, but seemed like he'd boxed himself in. It's like he just had to go ahead with it. But more importantly, and there's been a couple pieces written about this, like he also seems joyless and bored and not funny and like he's not enjoying himself. And none of the rest of us are enjoying it either. You can't sort of underestimate just the normal human emotion of boredom and like the interest in something new. Like it just doesn't seem as dangerous, as exciting. I don't know. Do you get that sense?
Well, I do think that he's in a weakened position. And I've been trying to look at this from a couple of angles, right? And on the one hand, I have never with Trump given his potency with the Republican base and his ability to dominate the media landscape. I've never wanted to take for granted as an analyst this idea that now they finally got him. They being, Republicans who oppose him, Democrats who oppose him. If you look at the course of his life in business and politics, the man often seems like he has 9 lives. I mean, he had 4 bankruptcies and still commanded a high-rated television show where he was the world's greatest businessman, which shows that he's very resilient and willing to push through more setbacks than most people, including narcissistic politicians. But I think that we also have to understand that Donald Trump in 2022 is not necessarily Donald Trump in 2015, 2016. And I wrote about this for the Examiner this week. In 2015 and 2016, Donald Trump was the ultimate change agent. He challenged Republican dogma that had grown stale in the Reagan era. He challenged Democratic dogma. He drew in longtime Democratic voters. He put together a coalition that included support in the suburbs and among independents. And he was able to do that because he was fresh and he was new. And even though he didn't win the popular vote, he won where it mattered. Donald Trump, having lost the presidency and 7 years later, is now more of a retread incumbent who is no longer a change agent. It doesn't mean he can't win the Republican primary. And if you're nominated, it means you can win. But he is not the same figure. And he even alluded to it in his speech, which I would say did not live up to the standard that Trump has set for himself. Occasionally during his presidency, he would give teleprompter speeches that were, at least according to expectations, not bad. In this one fell very short. But one of the things he said during that speech is, I guess I'm a politician now. I don't really like the way that sounds, but I guess it's true. But the thing is, he is just a politician now. And we've seen with 2-term presidents, usually in years 7 and 8, the country grows tired, even if they don't dislike them. And one other thing that could also be different this time around, depending on whether these people are willing to challenge Trump in a vigorous way, is in 2016 and throughout Trump's presidency, the choice for the Republican base was often Trump or going backward. That's how they looked at it. Well, you keep telling us we have to go back to the Republicans we used to have, and we don't like them. This guy is new and different and represents what we want today. But the figures that are available to Republicans now are not Reagan-era retreads. They're not going backwards. And so if any of these people are willing to run against Trump the way you need to show Republican voters that you're a fighter and willing to do the job, then it's not going to be as easy for Trump to come up with a catchy nickname and get rid of them.
Yeah, well, that's what I guess I mean about sort of learning a lot. I mean, I'm just watching the media, the Rupert Murdoch empire back in 2015, 16, like they would crap all over Trump, right? They didn't like him, but they would still put him on the cover to crap all over him. And so there was this constant amplification, and that's something that Trump knows really how to use to his advantage. This time they put him on like page 26. They had a totally different cover. Fox News cut away from him. And so there seems to be like an understanding of how you drain some of the oxygen from him. And these candidates will have learned something, right? They know he's going to come at them. I mean, before, Jeb Bush and Ted Cruz, they were like, what is happening right now? Like, this is not how these things go. But now people understand how he would come at them. And so they might be in a better position to deflect some of it. So I want to start by walking you through how our focus groups have thought about the Trump 2024 question. Now, we did dozens of groups of Trump voters after January 6th throughout 2021 and into 2022. And it was a pretty hard and fast rule that more than half of any Trump group would want to see Trump run again in 2024. That all changed with the January 6th hearings. Now, we did 9 groups during the January 6th hearings of 2020 Trump voters. And in 4 of those groups, we had 0 participants who wanted Trump to run again in 2024. That was a huge change. And it is when we started to see a lot more voters starting to think about electability, starting to think about other potential candidates. It's when we started to hear Ron DeSantis' name a lot more. So let's listen to how some of these Trump voters were talking during the hearing.
I do not want 4 more years of Orange Man bad and everybody screaming about every time he tweets. And believe me, he did some really bad tweets. I don't want 4 more years of that.
I think Trump did a great job for this country, especially since so many presidents focus on the East Coast and sometimes the West Coast, and then they forget about all the rest of the United States. And so it's nice to have a president who was focusing on the rest of us. And just so many things he did was great. But then we had all this stuff that happened that the media just pounced. And then since then, with the trials and everything, I think if he won presidency, there would be so much backlash from that. I don't know if it could be as effective as a presidency as he did with his first 4 years.
I would love for Trump to be president again. However, my only concern is that, would he actually get elected? Because I want to make sure that whoever does run has the best, very, very, very best chance of beating whoever the Democrat candidate is. And I just think the Democrat side would just have an absolute firestorm if he ran again. And I think they would pull out every punch, every trick, everything they can possibly do to not get him elected. Kind of like what happened with 2020. So for those reasons, even though most of the baggage is probably media based, stuff that the media has put on him, which a lot of stuff isn't warranted, I just think it would just cause too much of a firestorm.
He's older, and not to say that somebody of that age isn't able to do the job, but if you want to get 8 years, you don't know what's going to happen into your early 80s and late 80s. You don't want to be like Biden, who's having issues cognitively, and the same thing happened to Reagan.
All right. So there's a theme that has run through the voters since the January 6 hearings began, because that was when we started seeing this drift away. They still like Trump. They're not mad at him. They're not out on him. It wasn't that they were watching the January 6 hearings and deciding, boy, now that I know this about him, I'm very upset and I'm out on Trump. It was more just all the ephemera that surrounds Trump, the fighting, like the first woman said, Orange Man bad. They can't take the circus that kind of comes with him, or at least that's how they explain it. But I will say one postscript on this is that after the January 6 hearings happened, and then there was the search of Mar-a-Lago, there was a big rally round Trump effect in early August. The people didn't trust the FBI. And so I guess I feel like I can sense this shifting away if there are alternatives. But what do you think the chances are if Trump gets indicted, which it sounds like he may very well, that is the kind of thing that causes voters to come back to him? Or do you think it's the kind of thing that has them moving further away from him?
Well, I'm sort of 2 minds about this, because as we heard in the clips you just played, Republican voters, many of them still really like Trump themselves. Their potential move away from him is very pragmatic. I'm not sure he can win he may inspire so much Democratic turnout that it makes it harder for Republicans to win. Somebody mentioned the fact that you wouldn't have the potential for an 8-year presidency because Trump only gets one more term. So these are all pragmatic reasons to turn away from Trump. These are not voters concluding that the juice was not worth the squeeze after all. They're just worried that he's either can't win or wouldn't be able to do as well as he did the first time because of the firestorm he would generate around himself. And they said it wouldn't even be his fault. It's just the way it is. So it shows you that he hasn't necessarily lost Republicans. On the other hand, voters are often rather pragmatic about their choices in primaries. People forget, but one of the reasons why Trump was able to win in a divided field in 2016 was because a plurality of voters determined that he was the least ideological of the group, and they believed he had the best chance of defeating Hillary Clinton. And so if Republican voters look at their choices in 2024 and conclude that there is a better choice, no matter how they feel about Trump, I think given 3 consecutive electoral disappointments, there's a possibility they'll move away from him. But finally, I get to this point, you can't beat somebody with nobody. And this often comes up in discussions, Sarah, that I have with friends and family. It's like, when are Republican voters going to finally get fed up with him and just leave him? We've seen some of that happen. You've been at the forefront of that to some degree. But ultimately, Trump will be deposed because somebody else takes it from him. And so it's going to require a competitor or competitors in the Republican primary that go at him and make the case and give these voters somebody else to choose, even if they ultimately make the decision on pragmatic grounds and not a sense of falling in love.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And in these groups, when we ask the voters who they would like to see other than Trump in 2024, there is one name that clearly rises above the rest. You'll be able to guess who it is, but let's roll the tape.
Who wants to see Trump run in 24? Nobody. My Trump voters, tell me why.
Because I want DeSantis to win.
Is there anybody that you want to see step up or get a little more attention? Yeah, Trudy, who you have?
DeSantis.
Is there anybody else that comes to mind that you guys like, that a leader in the Republican Party that you'd like to see jump into a race like that?
Governor of Florida. Yeah, DeSantis.
Yep. Who likes Ron DeSantis? He's the current governor of Florida. Mark, Maggie, Stephen, Chris.
I'm hearing the governor of Florida. Seems like he's really conservative. And it's not that I'm against Trump. I just feel like it would be awful for the Republican Party if he ran. That's how I feel.
I'd love to see a ticket of DeSantis and Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota. I really think that would be a strong ticket. Both of them are leaders. And I know Brian's not a fan of DeSantis, but DeSantis led. I like what he's done in Florida. I understand what he's doing. But if he's going to be president, he's got to be able to build a consensus too. And I think all of us know that there are machinations that have been going on for a while to pave the way for DeSantis to be the candidate in a couple of years. And I think he's going to be the next president of the United States. Really would like to see Noem as his vice president.
There is no competition for the name that gets brought up. DeSantis is always the first name that people say, and he is always the one who has the highest name ID of Trump alternatives. But David, I don't know if you saw it, although I don't know how you'd miss it. DeSantis's God Made a Fighter web video that he put out a few days before the election.
Oh, I saw it.
I thought it was pretty weird. I thought it was pretty weird, but nevertheless, you make the point in your book, I think it's a correct point, that being a fighter is way more important to the GOP base than checking boxes from what you call sort of self-important conservative groups in DC. You also mentioned that cheap knockoffs of Trumpism are likely to fail and that Trump's base was intensely loyal because they viewed him as being very authentic. I agree with all of that. So do you think that DeSantis is a knockoff of Trump? And I had Caputo on here, Mark Caputo, who's a Florida reporter for one of these shows where we talked a lot about DeSantis. And he said that DeSantis has a bit of a glass jaw. What do you think of him? Do you think he's a Trump understudy?
Well, I think that Ron DeSantis as governor is a product of the Trump era and a Trump-inspired candidate. I think Republicans have flocked to him because he has been successful in Florida and because I think they view him as a more controlled, disciplined, effective version of Trump, a culture warrior willing to pick fights or fight back, if you will, against the media, dopes like me, Democrats, and Republican critics. And those are the very things they liked about Trump. But here they see somebody who doesn't get caught up, in their view, in petty fights with nobodies. He gets caught up in fights or picks fights with Disney and all of the sacred cows that you're not supposed to mess with. And these are things that they liked about Trump, but here they see a more refined version. And Florida having a reputation for being a swing state and a purple state, they're thinking this guy has improved his standing in a state like Florida. Imagine what he could do nationwide. Now, we could get into the weeds and talk about the mass migration of Republican voters to Florida during the pandemic because of his leadership in Florida through the pandemic, and maybe look at that state as a little bit more friendly territory for Republicans. But the scoreboard, as he pointed to the other day, doesn't lie, and winning by 20 points, even against a weak retread like Charlie Crist, is nothing to sneer at. I would say to Mark Caputo's point, and there's probably no better expert on Florida politics that I can think of, he does have a bit of a glass jaw, or at least an unproven jaw, in that as governor, he's had the benefit of getting into fights with all the right people from a Republican standpoint. He hasn't had to get into fights with other Republicans that people think highly of. He's been able to work with a legislature in Tallahassee dominated by the Republican Party. So when he wants to get something done, and he says jump, they say how high. And it's very easy to look like an effective chief executive when the other government body you have to work with is willing to do it. Running for president, running a national campaign, being attacked by a bunch of people that were praising you until the day you jumped in, and then they jumped in. We don't know yet how Ron DeSantis will function in an environment like that. He can be a very prickly politician, and the pressure that comes with running for president is immense, and it's impossible to understand until you do it. And so I think that he would have a lot to prove, but I don't think we can discount how much of a following he has cultivated in the Republican Party. I mean, I feel like in some ways I haven't seen anything like this since George W. Bush was governor of Texas in the late 90s, preparing to run for president. And all of the buzz was surrounding this Republican who had flipped Texas red, which was a relatively new phenomenon back then, who could speak Spanish and attracted a good portion of the Hispanic vote. And man, imagine what he could do nationally. And he ended up being the central figure and nominated in 2000 because of that. Now, we're in a bit of a different era. A lot more people now run, even if they don't know that they can win. The incentive structure is different, but as many questions as there are about Ron DeSantis, the buzz around him in the party among the grassroots is very real.
It is real. There's no doubt about it. I guess I take your point about W, but I also just as much see him as like Scott Walker, or there's other people that have risen to stardom for picking fights in their own state and looking like an effective governor, and then just collapsed on the national stage. And so I'm just not willing to sort of anoint this guy, especially because so many of these voters, the extent to which they have engaged with him is for the most part through viral clips of him yelling at teenagers, or because of the Don't Say Gay bill, or looking at him shouting at a reporter. They haven't necessarily seen him full on. They certainly haven't seen him go toe to toe. I mean, I watched his debate with Charlie Crist. He's so uncomfortable in his own skin. His smiles are kind of awkward. His suit's a little too big. When Crist,
he's a personally awkward dude.
Yeah, he doesn't have the natural charisma Trump does.
No, he does not have Trump's charm. If you engage with Trump one-on-one, as I have in a couple of interviews, both in person and on the phone, he can be charming as much as he can be bombastic. I call it rally Trump versus meeting Trump. You meet with him in person and there's a twinkle in his eye and he calls you by your first name and he stares at you. And, when the president of the United States, no matter who he is, looks at you and calls you by your first name, it's a very effective tool. Ron DeSantis has always been, when he was a member of Congress and I would interview him, I mean, he was gracious enough to take my questions, but he's a personally awkward dude. He He keeps everything close to the vest. When you run a national campaign, you need to rely on people. You need people willing to take fire in a foxhole with you. And I don't think that he's proven yet the ability to build a team and keep a team and deal with the incoming when it's not the kind of fire that is easily rewarded by Republican primary voters. And on top of which, look, other people will run. And once Republican primary voters see who these people are and see how they perform, presuming it's not just a Trump versus DeSantis race, which I wouldn't anticipate, then they'll take the measure of him. And look, maybe he'll perform really well and they'll conclude, you're everything we thought you were. But as you noted, we have seen before where candidates come and go at the top. And once voters have taken their full measure of them in the context of a Republican primary, either move on to somebody else or move back to the person they were with at the beginning.
All right, so I want to dig in on something we heard a bit in those other clips. So one thing our groups have historically liked about DeSantis is that he can deliver the things they like about Trump, but he is not quite as divisive. Let's listen to some of the voters talk about that.
His policies are a lot like what Trump's were, but he doesn't bring all of the Trump baggage with him. And the second thing is that given he has such a strong performance in Florida, I think he could be a viable contender, certainly on the national stage.
I think if you had someone like a DeSantis who would have the same policies as Trump, basically all the Trump stuff, just without that extra baggage that's baked in there already, I think that would help keep from alienating a section of voters. I think my worry, besides what the Democrats would do, is like, are we going to get those independent voters? And if we have someone like DeSantis, I think he has a better chance of pulling a lot of those independent voters out.
I think that he's a polished politician. The Floridians love him. He almost won by a landslide. He didn't the last time he ran. He marginally made it. This goes to show that he has a proven record that he is able to do, the things that he promises to do. I mean, not everything, but he's getting things done. And if you could do that for Florida, especially after this hurricane they dealt with, he managed it beautifully. I think he'll do a great job and hopefully help unify our country.
So both the first guy and the last guy in those clips were actually Biden 2020 voters. They were from flipper groups. And I think that a lot of the elite conservatives' interest, although somebody said it just now in these clips, so even our armchair pundits in the focus groups, they see DeSantis as being able to sort of put back together the old coalition. Like these independent voters will vote for him. These suburban voters will find him more palatable in a way that they don't for Trump. I understand why people think that, but I also look at him and think, this guy's not like quite a unifier. He sort of makes his bones on being divisive. He's got kind of that bullying instinct, and he's pretty conservative. Do you see him as somebody who could have a big draw with independent voters?
Well, I would look at it this way. First of all, let me just say, I think he has to prove that he has the ability to be a unifier in the way we think of a Reagan or a Clinton or an Obama circa 2008 versus a base-driven candidate, let's say circa Obama 2012 and Trump circa 2020. But what I would say is there were a number of soft Republicans or just Republicans generally, not to mention voters who are independents but lean conservative, that would have loved to have voted for a Republican for president in 2020. And I'm also thinking of all of those suburban voters in 2018, but just found Trump unpalatable. These voters didn't become liberal all of a sudden, let's say, or change their positions on fiscal policy or foreign policy. They just simply found Trump to be either unfit or they were exhausted by his antics and just wanted normalcy. So to the extent that the Republican Party in 2024 nominates a conservative who operates within the bounds of what the broad middle considers normal, I think that that could be a very strong candidate. And if DeSantis can do that by proposing policies that have broad appeal and managing how he picks fights, how he appeals to the base, then he could be that kind of a candidate. Look, we have seen in the past candidates that were either defined as very conservative or very liberal do quite well in a general election setting for president, because of the way they managed how they presented themselves and how they appealed to people. And it also, of course, depends on what the conditions in the country are. Democrats were able to maintain control of the Senate in 2022. The House is Republican, but only narrowly so. Whether Biden runs for re-election or there is a new Democrat in his place, voters could conclude after 4 years and not a big snapback in the midterm that we really would like a change in how the country is being governed from a policy perspective. And if Republicans could present somebody that's broadly acceptable, I have seen voters overlook all sorts of peccadillos before, as long as they don't find somebody unfit or unreasonable. And I don't see why DeSantis couldn't be that person. It just depends on how he manages himself in a national campaign, particularly if he runs, wins a nomination, and ends up a candidate in the general election.
Yeah, I think that analysis is spot on. Question is like, is he the kind of candidate ultimately that can do it? So DeSantis, as we mentioned, it got reelected by a Florida landslide at 19 points. When we talked over the summer to people who didn't vote for Trump in 2016, but did vote for him in 2020, we found people were largely supportive of DeSantis running for president. 8 out of the 9 people in this group from Florida would have preferred DeSantis for president over Trump. Let's listen.
I don't want to lose him as our governor.
I like that he's not a pushover. I don't want a soft guy. I want him to be forceful and stand up to people. I don't want him to be like a Biden where he's completely lost and doesn't know what he's doing. I like his family morals. I would agree with those statements of everybody else too, that he's very family oriented.
I like that he kept Florida open, very refreshing. He does let people maintain their freedoms as long as you're not hurting anyone else, which is why this whole Disney thing is happening. Yeah, I'm 100% A with him. Pretty close to an A+. But again, it's just a guy that aligns with a lot of our feelings, a lot of our morals. So yeah, I hope he makes it to 24 and he runs for president.
I don't like being told what I can and can't do. I am immunocompromised. I have 3 autoimmune diseases. But you know what? I've been dealing with this stuff since 2011. So I stay away from people. I don't get in people's faces, but I also don't like wearing a mask. It gives me high anxiety. And so I like that aspect of DeSantis kind of not allowing governments to tell us what we can and can't do.
So, a lot of love for him from this Florida group. But let me ask you this. This is one of the things that I think when it comes to Trump, you have to consider is that he doesn't really care about the Republican Party. He's not really a Republican. He's a guy who hijacked the party to use it as a vessel for his own ends. And so, let's say DeSantis mania sweeps the nation. And actually, he kind of blossoms into maybe a better candidate than we think he's going to be. And Trump's been kind of running against himself for 6 months because he's randomly announced in November of 2022. People are sick of him. What does Trump do? Could he drop out of a Republican primary and go run as an independent and grab 15% of the Republican Party in an independent lane and just burn the whole thing down?
Sure, he could. But I think Republicans, given that you could never count on Trump to not do that, because as you mentioned, he's not invested in the Republican Party. He never has been. He is more interested in adding to his power than adding to the party's electoral success. But he has been sort of burning the party down slowly. And I think after 3 electoral disappointments, I think the way they should look at it is that the risk factor is less, given that it's already happening. And it's a matter of whether or not you want to sit around and let it happen slowly and do nothing, or risk that it might happen fast, but at least you get it over with and you can rebuild. And what I mean by that is, take a look at the fact that Republicans are going to be in the Senate minority for another 2 years. It's a counterfactual exercise here, but imagine that Trump is a party person and understands that Jeff Flake just doesn't like him all that much, but that he seems to be a good representative for the state of Arizona, in that he reflects what a mix of Republicans and independents and soft Democrats would prefer. So he doesn't push Jeff Flake out of the party. And there's one Senate seat you've got back. In 2020, he doesn't tank the Georgia Senate races by complaining that the election was stolen and rigged and therefore don't go vote. There's 2 Senate seats. Then I could point to Michigan's 3rd congressional district and Washington's 3rd congressional district, where he pushed out Republicans because not nice to Trump. There are a couple more seats to pad the Republican majority in the House that's about to get seated in January. In other words, he's already sort of slowly ripping the party apart as Republicans tiptoe around him out of fear that they're going to make him mad and he's going to torch the place. So why not fight back? And maybe it burns down anyway, but then you can at least rebuild, because it's happening to you anyway. And look, if Trump had won re-election in 2020, and if they had won a big wave in 2022, then no matter what any of Trump's critics think of him, inside the Republican Party or not, well, you could just say whatever he's doing isn't hurting the party. In fact, the party is only continuing to build on the success that he started in 2016 by winning those Midwestern battlegrounds, the success in 2020 by improving Republican numbers with non-white voters. And we've got all this policy success, and this is the way. And not everybody likes it because of the downsides, and we know what all those are. But hey, it's working. At this point, Republicans are getting none of the upside and all of the downside, and it's just this slow burn. So if that's your fear, at this point, what do you really have to lose?
Man, I couldn't agree with that more. Just to add on to your point, it's also like the people who don't run, right? Who could, like Hogan didn't run for that Senate seat. Sununu didn't run for a Senate seat. They could have picked up a bunch of Senate seats. Ducey didn't run.
Doug Ducey might have run. Pat Toomey, maybe Pat Toomey decides to run for re-election.
Totally.
Because he doesn't feel like he's currently at war.
I think that's totally right. And I think at some point they got to rip the Band-Aid off. They can't let him hold him hostage with this idea that he could go run some independent party. They just got to do it. Okay, so DeSantis isn't the only Floridian looking at 2024. You mentioned in your book that Senators Marco Rubio and Rick Scott are looking at the race. And given that Rick Scott can self-fund a presidential race, and he recently challenged Mitch McConnell, although didn't go that great, is he picking up some Republican conservative fighter credentials? Could you see Rick Scott doing it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So as I write in my book, in full disclosure for the audience here, my wife is Rick Scott's chief fundraiser along with her business partner. And so I don't dig into his machinations too much. But what I would tell you is, as a political analyst, without asking him or his team any questions, everything that he has been doing seems to me to make sense if he's planning to run for president. But I have no idea on purpose how serious he is considering that at this point. But I will say, just to add to my point here about Senator Scott, getting into a fight with Mitch McConnell, who the Republican grassroots hates with the heat of 1,000 suns, is a very valuable thing to have in your back pocket if you're going to show up in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, or elsewhere and ask for votes in a Republican presidential primary, because you can say that, yes, I was in Republican leadership, and yes, I'm in Washington now, but you can see I don't get along with those guys. I went to war with them to try and change things. So it would make sense to me, but I purposely don't ask these questions. Marco Rubio is interested in running again, but he was very clear to me when I interviewed him for In Trump's Shadow, and I've not talked to him recently about this, that he was interested in doing it again if he felt there was a market for him and his agenda. He overhauled his domestic agenda, and it is really much more of an industrialist, populist agenda. His foreign policy has remained the same, rather hawkish and Reagan-esque. But Marco Rubio has been operating more like somebody who is content with the Senate than he is interested in trying his hand again. But with his kids grown and feeling freed up from a family perspective to pursue other political positions, I wouldn't necessarily rule it out. I do think, and this is something that wasn't considered 4 years ago, that the governor of Florida has become much more of a figure. And as Florida Republicans look at the donor pool for Florida money and the donor pool for outside of Florida money, that is going to have an impact on how they look at a presidential race. Although, as you mentioned, and this is just a known fact, Rick Scott has a fortune that he made as a businessman before running for governor of Florida, and he's proven that he's willing to spend it for his political campaigns.
Yeah. Well, like we said, you're at the Republican Jewish Coalition's meeting. They're in Vegas. I hope you're gambling. So I want to hear a mashup of some of the other people who are going to be in attendance there, and then some of them who won't. But these are the other names we hear a lot in focus groups that people bring up around 2024.
I thought Kristi Noem I think she would be great in a role like that. And that's who I wrote in at the time.
Oh, who's the lady? She's actually a Democrat from Hawaii. I've really always liked her.
Tulsi Gabbard.
Yes.
Governor
in Texas who sent the immigrants to D.C. I like that move.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I like too.
Abbott. What about Chris Christie?
Oh, no.
Any feelings for Christie? Any hands up? No?
I like Christie.
You like Christie? Okay.
Yeah. The same guy who closed the beaches and sat on the beach? Yeah.
How about Ted Cruz? Any Cruz fans?
Maybe if he shaved his beard and got a haircut.
You know, he's always changing.
I like Cruz. I think Florida's better, but I don't know.
Even though it's awkward, but she's a big Trump supporter and she's somebody that's very factual and strong. Candace Owens.
What about Mike Pompeo?
He lost a lot of weight.
Yeah, that's usually a sign that somebody's gearing up for some photo ops, right?
I like him better than Pence.
So I got to tell you, the names that come up, in addition to DeSantis, you heard it here. Kristi Noem comes up a lot, like sort of a surprising amount. Candace Owens also comes up sort of a disquieting amount of time. Part of what I think is funny is how much people are not interested often in like Chris Christie, Marco Rubio, like basically anyone who ran in 2016. They're kind of pretty ish on them. And they really want people who like came of prominence during the Trump reign that they see as part of kind of the broader Trump cinematic universe. Does that surprise you, or does that jive with what you've heard talking to voters?
Well, it doesn't surprise me because, as I wrote in Trump's Shadow, after talking to so many Republicans across the spectrum of the party, Republican voters really want candidates that are Trump inspired, if you will. They want fighters. They want fresh leadership. I mean, one of the reasons Trump did so well is many Republican voters believed that the party had grown stale. And so Kristi Noem, who was another proponent of allowing residents in her state to make their own decisions regarding the pandemic, that's a big selling point for her. But she is somebody that has really come of age as a Republican figure, even though she had been in Congress in the Trump era, and she was very supportive of him. And so I think what you're seeing is this trend where Republican voters are looking for somebody new, or at the very least, they don't want this sense of going backward. And when Trump defeated everybody in 2016, in a way, a lot of Republican voters were saying that as much as we might like Ted Cruz for what he's done, and Marco Rubio and Chris Christie for what he did in New Jersey, we're looking for a new era in the party. And so I think that's why it may be a little bit more difficult for candidates that voters believe are from the old guard. Now, we are going to see, and they are going to be here at the Republican Jewish Coalition Conference, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, Nikki Haley, Ted Cruz, Chris Sununu. And it'll be interesting to see how the actives here feel about a lot of these candidates. Pence and Pompeo are planning to run. Will they pull the trigger? Not sure yet, but they are actively planning to and have been dropping hints that they will run. And, you know, we will have to see if once they're candidates, they can change people's minds, as we were just discussing about, is DeSantis really the only guy? But can they change people's minds once they get into the race and attract the necessary support? I think what you're seeing is that people want Trump-inspired candidates. They just would like to do so without what they feel has become ineffective, counterproductive behavior.
You know, speaking of Mike Pence, we've got a bunch of sound on Pence. Let's just listen to how some of these voters have been talking about him in the groups.
He's milquetoast. He's a nice enough guy, but he's just milquetoast.
There's nothing exceptional about him. Even when he was the vice president, he was always in the background, and it was another instance of what's he doing exactly? We never really knew. Maybe that's just part of his personality.
The way he's acting, I mean, the shit was going down, everybody was against Trump. Oh, well, yeah, he's on that side too. I mean, don't be like a worm. I mean, pick your side and stand with it.
Mike Pence is the one that got rid of Flynn, General Flynn, and some other key players that are patriots. He helped get them out. And I read that Mike Pence was put there to manage Trump. And based on the things he did over the 4 years, it makes sense.
What initially made me vote for Trump the second time was, well, if it doesn't work out, at least I can get behind Mike Pence, And if I saw like a Mike Pence, DeSantis kind of ticket, I think that that's something that would be a hot ticket.
I'm not sure Pence is getting over the line if he doesn't have somebody like DeSantis with him to bring him over. I got to tell you, there's basically nobody who lives more in the sour spot with voters than Mike Pence. Like, the swing voters don't like him because they think he was too close to Trump, and the Trump voters don't like him because they think he's boring. Or they think he's a traitor, They get animated about him. It's usually in a negative way. But I guess the thing that I never understand, why don't Republicans talk more about, like, Sununu or Kemp? Like, Kemp just won by like a gajillion points against a Democratic boogeyman, Stacey Abrams. That doesn't get him any street cred. Like, Hogan has been like the third most popular governor in a blue state the whole time. Why do you think those guys never come up or get mentioned?
I think broadly, the reason governors like this don't come up based on the success they've had at the ballot box is because Republican voters, and I think this is true of Democratic voters too, they don't look at wins and losses as reasons for supporting candidates. They first look at somebody that inspires them, somebody who shares their values, somebody that they believe is a strong leader. And then as they sample all of those, they begin to look at electability, even though candidates who make that a central plank in their argument often fall flat. But that doesn't mean voters don't go through the paces on electability. And so I think that Hogan is a separate case because he's been a Trump critic and he still very vocally harkens back to the Reagan era as the model. But I think it's possible that if a Kemp or a Sununu got into the race and they were able to inspire, I think voters would then say, and not only that, did you see the landslide in New Hampshire? Republicans don't win there that often anymore. Did you see the landslide in Georgia? Man, Kemp, he just crushed it. So they're not going to say, wow, Kemp did great in Georgia or Sununu did great in New Hampshire, therefore I want to vote for him. But because neither of those are not considered never Trump Republicans or even anti-Trump Republicans per se, although Sununu dabbles in that occasionally, if they get into the race and they can inspire, then I think what a voter will do is say, oh man, I'm inspired by them. And not only that, I think they can win. If you take a look at the clips you played about DeSantis, it's like his values are great and he's getting all this stuff done. Oh, and he could win. Did you see what he did in Florida? This is the sort of the order in which voters go through the paces, and they always get to the electability part after they've gone through the other things that are important to them. Now, sometimes they will conclude that the person they really like is just simply unelectable, and they will make pragmatic choices about just having to vote for somebody else. And in some ways, you're seeing that as Republican voters now reconsider Trump. It's like, wow, I thought he was a great president, and I wish he could do it again, but I just don't know that he can win. So I think I'm going to have to look elsewhere. I think that's how voters tend to approach this.
Yep. And with that, I want to say thank you to David Drucker, the senior correspondent from the Washington Examiner and author of In Trump's Shadow, The Battle for 2024 and the Future of the GOP. David, thank you so much for being here. And thanks to all of you for listening to another episode of The Focus Group. I promise you we'll be back to do more election wrap-up. And so we will see you again very soon. Bye-bye.
Sarah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Focus Group podcast. I'm Sarah Longwell, publisher of The Bulwark, and this week we're doing our 2022 election wrap-up with a bit of a Focus Group retrospective. Going into Election Day, much of the conventional pundit wisdom crescendoed into prognostications of a big red wave. But if you were listening to the Focus Group podcast, you weren't that surprised by the little red trickle we ended up getting. We're going to talk about why so many of the races we've been following all year ended up breaking the way they did, and we're going to revisit past episodes that were signs of things to come, just like when, sitcoms used to do that thing where they'd cut together all the best clips. That's basically what we're going to do today. And my guest today is a three-peater, Amy Walter, editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report. Amy, my friend, thank you for being here.
Is this the first three-peater? Do I get a jacket?
You're always leading the pack.
I am so proud to be in that club. Thank you so much. And yes, I'll be waiting for my embroidered jacket in the mail.
I do love swag. So listen, You're on the record as a listener of this show.
Very much.
And sometimes you hear me shout you out because you're one of my favorite people thinks about politics.
I appreciate you. Yes.
And you've watched a bunch of these focus groups and have been on the show. So I just want to start by saying, in terms of how the election went, were you shocked like everybody else was, or did you feel like, yeah, this is kind of what I thought, mixed baggish?
Right. Mixed baggish, definitely, especially the Senate side, which I know this is where the focus group spent so much time. And what I really loved was listening to these voters really have to deal with their cognitive dissonance, right? They could both be unhappy about the economy and inflation, but also not really crazy about these Republican candidates that were being offered to them. And so you heard them wrestle through that. On the House side, I was expecting Republicans to do a little bit better in that you could see as we were coming into Election Day that so many of these Republican candidates were within the margin. Maybe they were down a point, maybe they were tied. And Sarah, you know as well as I do, when you go into sort of a traditional midterm election, the undecided voters break disproportionately for the party that's out of power, right? The change party. But in this case, that didn't happen. And I think it was surprising to see some of these candidates really hold on, despite the fact that both sides saw polling that showed these races were leaning, if not toward Republicans, were likely to break that way. But overall, I don't think anybody should have been surprised that Republicans, they win the House, not by as big a margin as they'd like to see. But as you and I have talked about from the very beginning, candidates matter in statewide races when those states happen to be purple toss-up states. It didn't matter as much in the big dark red states or the dark blue states. It matters immensely in purple states. And that's where the focus group comes in.
That is where these swing voters, we were listening to what they were telling us. They were telling us all kinds of things were wrong. They were frustrated with Joe Biden. They were frustrated with the economy. But man, when it came down to just vote choice, these candidates, in a lot of ways, they couldn't get there. But obviously, one of the big things that kind of overhangs this election, we'll get into a bunch of state-specific stuff in a second, but I wanted to go back to a group of suburban women who voted for Trump in 2016 and then Biden in 2020. And this group happened 2 weeks after the Dobbs opinion was leaked. And I think the woman you're about to hear was the start of a long trend in the focus groups. Let's listen.
I'm very concerned about Roe v. Wade. I'm Catholic. I consider myself pro-life, but I do also agree that there is a time and place where abortions are necessary. And the idea that the Republicans are kind of pushing that shit through it scares me. Something that's been precedent for 50 years or however long it's been, longer than I've been alive. And that just makes me really nervous. And not even necessarily just that, but what I've heard about how that can domino effect into other areas like same-sex marriage and things like that. And so our elections are tomorrow. And so looking at candidates, it's hard for me to, with that new knowledge, so quickly trying to look at the candidates and say who's going to be able to do something. Because I do consider myself more of a fiscal conservative and more, moderate to left leaning in terms of social issues. I think maybe for the longest time, I've just sort of done the Republican ticket because I kind of had my blinders on and said, well, fiscal conservative, that's kind of what I feel like the Republicans are more so. But now I think the social issues are becoming more important for me to consider when I'm voting.
So we're going to talk about abortion a lot in the context of other races, but we just heard this over and over again, the abortion thing, where it wasn't the thing that was front of mind or dominating. They did care about the economy. But when you get to vote choice, the vote choice, it was one of the big things that people put out there for why the candidates were too extreme. And so how do you think abortion ultimately ended up affecting things?
I do think that it had the impact of, one, it really did engage or maybe re-engage the Democratic electorate or the Democratic coalition, however we want to frame it. Think back to where we were in 2021 in November. The president's job approval ratings were pretty much where they were on election day, in the mid 40s. And yet his party loses the governor's race in Virginia, a state he won by 10 points. And abortion was an issue that was used by the Democratic candidate, Terry McAuliffe, to try to call out Glenn Youngkin as being too extreme. Even having him on tape saying, don't worry, when the election's over, we'll be able to do more on this issue. I just can't talk about it publicly. It didn't seem to move the needle because it was a theoretical conversation. By the time Dobbs happens, it's now, this isn't theoretical anymore. This is reality. But the thing to me, Sarah, that was really perplexing was how differently the issue played in different states, right? So Texas passes a 6-week ban, and there's frustration about it on the left and within the abortion rights community. But it doesn't seem to have any impact at all in the governor's race or even as a top of mind issue. Or Georgia, a swing state where, again, they passed a law that was very restrictive, wasn't playing a starring role as much as it was in Pennsylvania or Michigan or even Wisconsin. So where it mattered a lot. I think it did in some of these suburban districts that Democrats won in 2018, those former Republican districts filled with a lot of women who sounded like that focus group woman. I'm a Republican because I'm a fiscal conservative. I consider myself pro-life, but I don't consider myself in favor of government restrictions, right? And so those are the voters, I think, that were very much in play. And it was, you're right, it was hard to understand how significant that was going to be in their vote. And what we saw were voters who both said, I don't think the economy is doing well. I don't really like Joe Biden that much, but I'm going to vote for a Democrat.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're going to work our way from east to west as we talk about the states. And I want to start in my home state, Pennsylvania. And I can tell you there is no candidate more reviled in these focus groups this year than Doug Mastriano. I mean, we could basically not find a swing voter who's voting for Doug Mastriano, which makes sense. Dude got crushed by 15 points. But the thing that was interesting to me, actually, from the Pennsylvania focus groups was that the voters actually liked Josh Shapiro. And I just want to play a couple of clips from swing voters who foretold this sort of absolutely crushing Shapiro victory.
Mastriano scares the crap out of me.
He's terrifying.
He terrifies me. He terrifies me.
Yeah.
I have a friend who lost 2 babies, and if he gets in office, what he wants to do is she would have had to carry those babies to term and suffer through it. That's ridiculous.
I always liked Josh Shapiro. I thought that he would make a good governor. When he announced his candidacy, I knew that he would make a good candidate because he's helped a lot of people. I've had problems with something that he helped with. I had a contractor do something to me, and Josh Shapiro was instrumental in helping me get back my money. So, it's not just that, but I feel like he's a man of his word.
This is just not always the case. You can get a lot of negative polarization where people are voting for the lesser of two evils. But I think what really just jumped out at me was how much a lot of the swing voters actively liked Josh Shapiro. Were you watching him? Do you think he's got, I hate to do this, such a hack question.
Does he have a future?
Does he have a future? You think this guy could be a 24, 28 candidate? What do you think?
He's absolutely going to be in the mix. And it is somewhat unfortunate, to your point, that a lot of people are going to look at that race and say, well, of course he won. He was running against a guy that every swing voter you ever interviewed said, he scares me, right? So how hard can it be? But part of the reason I think he came into the race with pretty good favorable rating and a good base is that he spent his time as attorney general doing the thing that somebody like Maura Healey, who we'll probably hear a lot about too, the new governor in Massachusetts in terms of her future, going after big pharma, going after corporate actors that played badly.
The
And
Catholic
of course,
Church.
the Catholic
Yeah.
Church and the sex abuse scandals there. So both of them taking on big, powerful institutions. The fact that she is able to, and Josh Shapiro, able to sell something more than just, look, I'm the Democrat. You like me because I'm going to be good on all of the touchstones and cultural issues, but instead to say, actually, I've shown that I can deliver for you and I'm willing to take on even the biggest, most powerful institutions. That has an appeal that goes beyond partisanship. All these new governors, Sarah, don't you think we're going to hear a lot about these new Democratic governors?
I do. I mean, look, I think one of the things I've said to Democrats, you know, you guys don't have a lot of a bench here, and they didn't seem to have a lot of good surrogates. And part of their messaging problem is not their message as much as their lack of messengers. And I think that's the problem with these big fields of candidates on both sides is like people get sort of overexposed as presidential candidates. And then people start looking around like, ugh, I don't want Elizabeth Warren again. And like, ugh, no Bernie Sanders, you know, and it's like, okay, well, like, who are the new people? And I think that Whitmer, you know, winning by 10 points, I think Shapiro, I just think it gives the Dems a few more stars, people to look at and contemplate. And even, you know, some people to give some lessons on, hey, how do you win in some of these purpler states?
Right.
Just shout out to Maura Healey as part of the lesbian tsunami that
That's
swept
right.
in.
All two
of them.
I mean, two more than ever.
Two more than ever. Hey, you know, I gotta say, it's a pretty decent out of what, 50?
Yeah,
it's a decent representation for the lesbians.
There we go. We'll get them all in.
All right. So let's talk about Pennsylvania Senate. So this race was called for Fetterman on election night. The final margin is about like 4.5 points, which is really, really solid. So Fetterman outperformed Joe Biden in a lot of key places like Lackawanna County, which is Scranton, Erie County. And if you compare the Oz-Fetterman map to the Trump-Biden map, you'll see a lot of rural red counties that break 76% for Trump, but only 70% for Oz. And we had talked to some of the Trump-Biden voters, the swing voters in the suburbs, who were really squeamish about Fetterman. And this was what was interesting to me is I think our typical swing voters that were the Trump to Biden voters, actually, a lot of them started to come around to Oz because they were kind of these college-educated suburban folks that were like, I don't know about Fetterman. But even back in May, when we were talking to just Trump voters, the straight up sort of Trump voters in the more rural areas, we found real openness to Fetterman and some real mistrust of Oz. Let's listen.
He did go around and have all these town halls all over the state, which at least he heard both sides of the issue. I have to give him that. I did like his ads that he was running during the primary. I've seen some of those, but apparently they're not true from what I'm hearing. But I would consider him, but I would have to research it a little bit more.
Oh, I plan on voting for him. And, you know, recreational marijuana, I mean, again, you know, what's the issue? You know, it's definitely not the same as alcohol. And I smoke, so I know I've been smoking for a long time. But I mean, yeah, I'm totally for that.
I think from obviously a medical standpoint, he's brilliant. From a political standpoint, I think he's putting on a front, quite honestly. You know, I think he's trying to follow what he thinks Trump did, which is I've got a good TV show, I've got a lot of money, I've got friends everywhere you look. So I think he's thinking, well, if Trump did it, I can do it too. Mm-hmm. And then he got the endorsement of Trump. So he's like, well, if Trump thinks I can do it, then I really can do it. So for me, like, stick with what you're good at.
These are all Trump voters, just through and through Trump voters, 16, 20. And they never liked Oz, this group of people. And so what do you make of Fetterman? And do you think that running people like him is something Democrats will try to emulate now going forward and trying to pick up more of these sort of white working class voters in these swing states?
Right. It works in some places and it doesn't work in others, right? We had a real life experiment in 2022. Tim Ryan, he was essentially running a similar campaign as John Fetterman. He just happens to be running it in Ohio, a state that is much redder than Pennsylvania. But I remember so well, Sarah, listening to that podcast and thinking, that's really interesting. But, by the time we get to the fall, Republicans will have basically taken the bark off of Fetterman and exposed him as he's a Bernie liberal, he's soft on crime. And now you go back and you listen to those folks, and it was pretty clear that that was going to be a harder message to sell than we believed, or certainly I believed at first, because they had this image of him as just a regular guy who wants to decriminalize marijuana, who looks genuine compared to, as that one woman put it, the guy who's been on TV forever and thinks, how hard can it be to run for office? So that authenticity gap was so important. And to me, I just keep going back to the summer right after the primary. So June, July, Oz kind of disappeared.
Totally.
And there was this vacuum there that the Fetterman campaign brilliantly filled. And they made this race of, I'm the regular guy, he's the outsider. He's the New Jersey guy, he's the huckster, he's a fraud, I'm the real deal. And by the time the Oz campaign got up and Republicans got up on the air with the crime and the he's too liberal piece, it did some damage to him. But you're right, it wasn't enough to convince probably some of those voters in your focus group that he was too risky of a pick, right? Which is the bigger risk, going with Fetterman or going with Oz? And they just, I think we're ready to say, Fetterman may end up being a liberal Democrat, but at least he's like the real deal, as opposed to this guy who doesn't even seem like he knows anything about what he's talking about.
These are places where you'll do focus groups with Trump voters who also like Bernie. There just is that sort of core of voters that kind of hate the establishment and they want the authenticity, and they're really kind of hate the slick political performance stuff. And I think that what was showing up in the polling as Oz closing the gap, because he was closing it, the crime stuff was really landing with the suburban voters. It just was. A lot of the swing voters we were talking to, this is one of the races I got kind of weak-kneed on, even though I knew how intensely people loved Fetterman. It was all over the groups. It was just all over the groups how much people love Fetterman. But I was like, I don't know, man. The suburban voters, the crime stuff was working, and it stuck to certain people like Mandela Barnes and Fetterman more.
They have a record on this.
They do. They have
this isn't
unlike Shapiro, who has a very different record on it, right?
Correct.
And so it was sticking to them with those suburban voters who didn't want to see crime coming out of the cities and into their suburbs. But for the rural voters, the Trump voters, or just the redder areas, they didn't watch Fetterman's debate. They didn't care about Fetterman's debate. They just thought he was a fine dude out there in Pittsburgh. They were like, this guy's good. Who is Dr. Oz? Dude's not even from here, which was basically Fetterman's message. And I think was a lot of advantage, to your point about Oz being gone, to some of these Democrats who they did this with Tudor Dixon too, where they spent a lot of money and defined these candidates early. Tudor Dixon was defined by her comments around, if a 12-year-old's raped, she should have to carry the baby to term. And Fetterman defined Oz as an outsider, and even the crime stuff, none of it could overcome it. I'm supportive of some of this idea of setting the narrative early and trying to lock people in, because I think that worked.
Yeah, but Fetterman had the other advantage, which was a very non-competitive primary, shall we call it?
Sure.
So Connor Lamb didn't lay a glove on him. And meanwhile, Republicans are beating themselves silly over all kinds of stuff. And, we all assumed that Republicans would eventually come home, which you're right, they did, but they came home inconsistently. You know what I would like to do? I haven't done this yet, but is to put the map of Fetterman and then say a Bob Casey, or maybe even in the long ago days, like the early 2000s or the 90s, where Democrats would do much better in Lackawanna County, would do much better in those working class areas around Pittsburgh than they would in the suburbs of Philadelphia. He didn't put that entire coalition back together because it's never going to look like that again. But being able to do both of those things, right? Do well enough in the suburbs and hold on to some of that old coalition in Scranton and Pittsburgh, that is a good model. But again, it has to be the right candidate and it has to be the right state. And so to me, one of the stories of this election was candidates mattered a lot, but not everywhere.
Yeah. All right, let's go to Michigan, where Governor Gretchen Whitmer beat Tudor Dixon by about 10 points. And there was also a ballot initiative to add the right to reproductive freedom to the state constitution, which passed by about 13 points. Now, this is one of those races where people were wigging out right at the end. They were like, oh my God, Whitmer's in trouble. I never thought Whitmer was in trouble because our Michigan swing voter groups, even though they had kind of mixed reviews of Whitmer, Dixon was like a non-starter. Let's listen.
I think Whitmer did a pretty good job with the pandemic. And I think she did a pretty good job with everything except fixing the roads. But I mean, we've had a lot of other candidates promise more than that and not come through with as much. So, but I really don't like Tudor Dixon because of the abortion thing as well as her being a Trump supporter. So I said I was on the fence, but I'm leaning more towards Gretchen.
You know, she locked the state down early, but then kind of the restrictions kind of just went away and there was really no explanation, you know, of opening up or why we were shut down for so long. And over time, I've now seen different ad and campaigns for Tudor Dixon. You know, I kind of disagree with her stance on abortion and things like that. So that's where I'm kind of like in the middle. I wish another candidate would stand out. But right now, that's probably my two choices. I'm leaning more towards Gretchen.
So we did a bunch of swing voter groups in Michigan, and people are mad about the roads. Gretchen Whitmer, if you're listening, you have to do something about the roads. People are very upset about them. And they had lots of COVID complaints, but like 10 points, right? That is a big, impressive victory. And so it's weird because it felt like from the focus groups that they were doing a lesser of two evils thing. Like they just did not like Tudor Dixon. But I don't know, in a swing state like Michigan, like Trump won Michigan in 2016. Like, what do you make of a 10-point victory for Whitmer?
I do think this is where an issue like abortion, and isn't this another Secretary of State
lunatic
race?
Karamo.
Okay.
Christina Karamo.
So,
yeah, total nutcase.
Okay, because I know you've talked about her and the many other Secretary of State election deniers. So the energy was all on the Democratic side, right? With that ballot initiative, Tudor Dixon, the Secretary of State's race, two competitive House races. And by the way, they both overperformed too, Alyssa Slotkin and Dale Kildee, in districts that are really tough. And the exit polls, right, take it with a grain of salt, et cetera. But this was one state where the abortion issue, it was something like 40+% of voters said that was their top issue. I mean, it blew away inflation as a top issue. And that's what's fascinating about these governor's races, right? If we had this conversation in February of 2021 and we said, what do you think the governor's races are going to be about next year? We would say,
COVID, yeah.
Their reaction to COVID. And then, of course, we watched November 21 and the schools and parents, and absolutely it's going to be about COVID. It wasn't about COVID at all, right? And I remember listening to this podcast with
Tim Alberta.
He makes a very good case for why her pandemic behavior, both personal as well as the rules for the state, rubbed people the wrong way, and it could be a liability. But at the end of the day, it wasn't anything like that.
Yeah. I mean, I got to say, though, when I watched her debate, I was like, you're actually good. You're good. I think you're impressive.
Yeah.
There's no way you can bounce out of a swing state like Michigan with that kind of a margin and not start getting some real energy behind you.
Oh, there is no doubt about that pressure that is going to be on her or on the others in the Democratic Party to be pushing her. I don't know. Is it 24? Is it 28? Whatever it is, she is absolutely on the short list.
She's on short list, yeah.
No
All right,
doubt.
let's head to Nevada. So secret normie Joe Lombardo eked out a win in the governor's race over Democratic Governor Steve Sisolak. We had only one person receptive to him in our group of disaffected Nevada Democrats. I actually liked this group. This was a different kind of group for us. You know, we knew that in Nevada, the thing that everybody was worried about was that all these Democrats who were mad were going to vote against Sisolak for the governor, and then Cortez Masto, who was like the most endangered member of the Senate. That's the one Republicans really thought they could pick up because they just thought these like independents and sort of soft Democrats were going to come their way. But Interestingly, we did detect a lot of people being upset with Sisolak, but nobody was interested in Adam Laxalt, who ended up losing to Catherine Cortez Masto. And there was a major reason why. Let's listen.
I love Cortez Masto. I think she does her best to serve the Nevadans. She's doing great with healthcare, lowering the cost of medications. And I mean, she's working with law enforcement. She's doing a great job, in my opinion.
I think she's, doing okay. I wouldn't say great, but it seems like she kind of goes to bat for Nevada. I'm not saying, I always land on their side, but I think we could do worse for sure.
I'm undecided. I just know that he ran for governor a while ago and lost. And pretty much, I know that he's pro-life and it's kind of extreme.
With the pro-life, but it's not just that. It's with no exceptions for rape, incest, or to save the mother's life if needed.
Right.
And that's a definite no for me, no matter what.
So this was one of those groups where they did the thing where nobody talked abortion at the top, nobody said it was a key issue, but then as soon as it came to candidate choice between Cortez Masto and Laxalt, abortion and the extremism overall became the thing. And I had Ralston on. Ralston watched a couple groups with me. Ultimately, he predicted, and he out on a limb on this. He predicted that Sisolak was going to lose and Cortez Masto was going to hang on. And I think, I know, because he came on right before the election, that part of was watching groups like this, because people were mad at Sisolak over some of his COVID stuff. But with Cortez Masto, they're like, yeah, she's okay. But more, they were also like, Laxalt's a crazy man.
Right. And this is another place where the funding issue mattered. I don't know when Cortez Masto first went up. I'd have to go look at the logs from Ad Impact, but she was up on the airwaves very early with ads that focused almost exclusively on how she had helped Nevada come back from the pandemic. And obviously, this is a state where the pandemic not just hit incredibly hard, because this is a state that needs tourists and conventions, et cetera, to thrive. But it also hasn't bounced back as quickly as other parts of the country. So people still struggling here. And so she had to make the case that even though things hadn't really gotten 100% back to normal, she was doing all that she could to get resources back to folks who were hurting. And so I think that's what you heard from that very first voter, right? Which was, look, she's doing her best. She's trying hard. She's helping us with healthcare. So those ads clearly were having an impact. And then, this is something that John Ralston said to us too from the very beginning, and I know on your podcast, which was Laxalt wasn't a very good candidate. He looked good in comparison to the other people that we've been talking about, Sarah. But in terms of quality in a swing state, Lombardo was the much stronger candidate. In fact, if you had flipped the tables, put Lombardo in the Senate race, I'd be very curious to see what would have happened in that instance, because Lombardo was from Clark County and understood then what it means to have to win in a swing state and made the economy the issue, which, again, when we're talking about the governor's race and the impact that COVID restrictions had on people's livelihoods, it was a more compelling message and one that I think resonated more with voters.
Yeah, we call him a secret normie in our shop because he started out in the primaries kind of yunkiny, but he was doing some of the election denial stuff, but he never went very hard on it. And as soon as he was in the general, he pivoted hard to the economy and never really looked back.
Well, and then who had that story about how Trump learned that he didn't say he was a great president during the debate? And Trump was mad and let him know it. And so at the last Trump rally in Nevada, he made sure to say he was a great president while he was on the rally stage, but then didn't really mention him again. So you're right. It is very yunkiny where you're able to appease the Trump wing of the party without alienating enough of the independent voters. And it's hard to do. And in fact, he's the only Republican to defeat a sitting Democratic incumbent.
Yeah, because Evers pulled it out there in Wisconsin.
That's right.
Okay, let's go to Arizona. So Mark Kelly defeated Blake Masters by about 5 points in the Senate race.
Yeah.
And I thought this race was really driven by personalities and, you and I talked some about vibes the two candidates gave off. Mainly the people thought Masters was a weirdo. So McConnell ally Stephen Law reportedly said that Blake Masters was the worst testing candidate in focus groups he'd ever seen, which sounded very familiar to me. So let's listen to what our focus groups thought of the candidates, starting with Masters.
My impression of Blake Masters is that he could be as dangerous to Arizona as Trump was near the end of his term. And of course, Trump supports him, so figure it out.
He is not my choice at all. I just think he can't be trusted. I think he is just like Trump in some cases. So no, I'm not a fan.
Some of this is due to the TV ads you see with all his quotes and everything. And, I just sit there and I'm like, okay, we've reached double digits on very questionable things he said. He did make the comment about he's strong on abortion one way with no exceptions. And then when he realizes that it doesn't work well for his campaign, he goes back and whitewashes his website of everything. His comments about the Unabomber, his comments about the military leadership, privatizing Social Security. But it's just one thing after another. And it's like, at what point is this guy he's shady. There's something about him that's shady. He's young too. He's only like 35 years old. I'm older than the guy.
I think we need the Republican vote in the Senate. But Blake Masters is not the Republican vote that I want there. Or at least he's not the guy with the Republican vote that I want there. So it falls back on, I got to go with Kelly. I don't like Kelly for a lot of reasons. He's anti-gun and so on for obvious reasons. Sure, but he's the lesser of two evils here, and I got to go with him. He seems more of the diplomatic type. Blake Masters doesn't strike me as the diplomatic type.
Masters just was unlikable. He was an unlikable guy, and the voters didn't like him. And even when they were not that hot on Kelly, and Kelly was getting tied to Biden a little bit, they were still but he's fine. He's fine.
I remember early in the cycle talking to a Republican strategist who said, the best thing for the Masters campaign would be to not run ads with him in them. That's what they need to do. But he kept going to camera, right? All the ads were to camera. What I love about not just these focus groups, but just campaigns in general, we assume that, oh gosh, voters don't pay attention and they don't really care. And you can just run millions and millions of dollars worth of ads and win that way because these are big states, big media markets. Voters can sniff out people really quickly and immediately go, don't like that person. Don't trust her. Oh, that person seems like they're authentic. That person is totally faking it, right? They do it instantly. And I think that was pretty clear from the beginning that Masters' only hope here in winning this race was that Biden would just totally collapse and bring Kelly with him, and that Kelly was just going to get caught up in the depressed Democratic base. But what we saw in every one of these races, and this is why your Trump to Biden voters and your swing voters mattered so much, because how did they all win these races? Somebody like Mark Kelly, somebody like Cortez Masto. They're winning independent voters by either double digits or high single digits. That's not supposed to happen in a midterm election. The out party wins the independent voters, right? Those are the folks, the ones who say, I don't really like Biden. They're still voting for the Democrat. I'm somewhat disapproving of the economy. They voted overwhelmingly for the Democrat. So to not be able to sell your candidate at a time when people don't feel great about the incumbent party is pretty remarkable.
Dude, and you were onto this. This is something I remember reading from you early on, which was the decoupling of these candidates from Biden and how just unusual that is.
It's so unusual. I mean, I looked at the group of voters who called themselves somewhat disapprovers, right? So they didn't hate Biden, but they also didn't think he was doing a very good job. And in all these different polls, they were voting for a Democratic candidate with a huge undecided. And so talking to pollsters and other campaign folks, it was like, okay, these are a really interesting group of voters, but I bet they're just not going to end up voting. They probably sit this out. They're younger. They're probably less motivated. Well, it turns out they did show up and they voted for Democrats by 4 points. Just as a point of reference, in 2018, those somewhat disapprovers of Trump they voted for Democrats by 30 points.
Yeah.
So, like, that just doesn't happen, right? This was supposed to be an election about the economy. And yet, the candidates, and we'll go back to the first issue, the issue of abortion, make this much more of a choice election than one just about the economy. In the same way, Sarah, that 2018 wasn't about the economy. Remember? Republicans were like, this will be fine. The economy is awesome. People are really happy with their 401k, and Trump has actual positive approval ratings on the economy. Yeah, voters were like, yeah, the economy's doing well. I'm not voting for a Republican. Are you kidding me? I hate Trump. I'm not voting for them.
I'm gonna loop back around to some of this because I want to dig in at the end to talk a little bit about Trump and other things that were informing these decisions. But I want to just finish with, I think it's the race I was just the most scared about, just the governor's race in Arizona, because Katie Hobbs was just clearly the weaker candidate. Like, she was a weaker candidate than Kelly. Kerry Lake was a stronger candidate than Masters in a lot of ways. And yet Hobbs was able to hang on. Let's hear what voters thought of Hobbs and Lake, starting with Hobbs.
I don't think she'll hurt us too much. I don't think she's going to do anything good for the border. I don't like the idea of supporting sanctuary cities, things like that. But I don't know if she can accomplish that anyway. So, yeah, it's just the extreme other side is what scares me more, I think. And we probably will still have a Republican state-led, government. So other than the governor, so I don't know what she can get done.
Kerry Lake is a nut job. He is. Tell us what you really think. He's a right of right. I don't think she's in touch with anybody that is even close to even conservative, let alone moderate. I mean, she is so far to the right that, I think she will destroy Arizona if she has the opportunity. And unfortunately, our legislature will feed right into her politics. So she scares the hell out of me. And I hope that there's a chance that she will not win. But unfortunately, right now, polling is looking like she is leading from what I see.
So in the focus groups, and we did a bunch in Arizona because obviously it was a really important state. It had a big governor, secretary of state race, and also a Senate race. So we went in there a lot. I did find swing voters mostly going for Hobbs, but in this group, I remember there were at least two guys who were going to vote for Lake. It was funny because one was a Lake Kelly voter.
Yeah, how do they sort of rationalize the Lake Kelly voter?
He was mad at Hobbs for not debating. He thought it was just a weak sauce move. And, I've seen people subsequently sort of try to retcon the Hobbs decision not to debate and say, like, see, it was the right thing to do. I continue to disagree with that. I think she should have. However, there's no denying she won. She won by less than 20,000 votes, but that's a bigger margin than 2020. And I want to run a theory by you, which is it's different state to state, as you've noted, and I completely agree. Like, these states are just so different. But, like, there's a shifting that's going on in the political coalitions, and there's some political realignment where you see these college-educated suburban voters moving more to the Democrats because they hate this Trumpy brand of Republican politics, and Republicans picking up more of these working-class voters, not just white working class, but, working-class voters in general. And normally, I argue that Democrats are getting the worst of that alignment because there's just more working class voters than there are college educated voters. However, in a midterm election, these college educated suburban voters are more likely to turn out. And I think that was just a big help in a state like Arizona. What do you think?
I think that's exactly right. And look, when we have the final numbers for this election, I'm very curious to see that because I think what we saw in many of these competitive races in suburban areas, more white than not, you had really pretty significant turnout. But in places in California, Florida, and New Jersey, safe Democratic districts that are majority minority districts, very low turnout. And where the Democrat is winning by 15 points in districts that Biden carried by 30. And so that's really the question, Sarah, which is what happens when you get a sort of quote unquote traditional turnout? And Carlos Odio, who is an analyst with the Equis group on the progressive side, working on issues with Latino voters. And his analysis thus far in Arizona was that in Maricopa County, in those Latino heavy precincts, it's not that Hobbs and Kelly did better than, say, the 2018 cinema showing, but they didn't do worse than 2020, right? So they basically held steady, which is that ultimately the kinds of voters they needed to win in those Latino, precincts did continue to vote for Democrats, and the coalition that has succeeded in electing Sinema, Kelly, Biden, and now Hobbs is suburban Phoenix and Latinos, right? It's still there. This to me is sort of the whole thing about the 2022 Senate races and governors too. But you go, all right, where's the battleground for control of the Senate and governorships? Okay, mostly in states that Biden narrowly carried in 2020. All right, so what kind of candidates should Republicans put forward in these states? Should they put forward candidates that look a lot like the candidate who lost there in the 2020 election, or a candidate that maybe could win there? You know what? Let's go with the candidate who lost, right? Let's just have more cowbell, right? Like a Trump-like candidate in a state that Trump lost in 2020 did not ever seem like a great idea. However, if I'm a Democrat looking at this election, I wouldn't feel great overall about the percent of the vote that moved to the right. I mean, part of the reason Republicans did not do as well in the House is that they underperformed in those districts that Biden won by like 1 to 7 or so points. But what happens when you get a general election electorate that, especially when it comes to Trump, he turns out people that we just cannot find. They don't come out at other times. And so I always worry about spending too much time looking at a midterm electorate and assuming it's going to translate over to the next presidential. But I think you're right in that you say, well, who is more likely to turn out in a midterm election? And why has that traditionally helped Republicans up until the sort of Trump era? Well, because it's white, more educated, and wealthier voters that tend to turn out consistently. And that would help Republicans win in a lot of those districts. But now Democrats have those districts.
That's right. Hey, just as like a way to wrap up, your baseball analogy was one of my favorite things that I saw on Twitter.
Thank you.
I would like to give my own sort of like, here's what I think happened, just as a kind of a wrap up. But why don't you do the baseball thing and like give your, here's what I think happened, like succinctly in 22.
Succinctly, so if we think about it in baseball terms, part of my frustration with the way that many people cover politics is that they cover it basically just in the ninth inning. And so if somebody hits a home run and the game's over, it's a walk-off home run, you say, oh, well, so-and-so won the game. But there are a whole lot of other innings that led to that moment, things that did or didn't happen that allowed that home run to be decisive. And so if I think about the 2022 election in that term, we start off the first couple of innings, Democrats start off a little bit in a hole, only in that we know historically it's hard for the party in power to win in a midterm election. So let's say Republicans maybe started with a man on base, but where Democrats got a good 2-3 innings because the Biden administration was following through on the promise made in the campaign. We're going to get past COVID and the economy was going to come back. And that worked until about June, July of 2021, when it all kind of came crashing down with Delta and inflation. And then, of course, Afghanistan, and then the infighting in Washington. And that's basically innings 4-5 or so, where it becomes, oh my gosh, this is looking like a traditional midterm election blowout, especially after the results in Virginia and New Jersey. But we get into the spring, I guess. So we're now in like the 6th inning or so. Things are still looking pretty dire for Democrats. But then we get into, well, let's call it 6 and 7. And that's the summer of 2022. That was sort of the turning point in this game where we have the Dobbs decision. We have success legislatively for Democrats, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act. Republicans are fighting amongst themselves. Democrats are kind of united. And then, of course, Donald Trump taking up all the oxygen for most of the summer, whether it was Mar-a-Lago or January 6th, or his rallies and his attacks on Republican candidates. And it kind of puts the game into a very different place where it looks like now this game is tied up. But then I think it really was the last couple of innings where it's true the momentum was shifting. You could see it in the polling. It was tightening up. That lead that Democrats had in the 6th and 7th inning was starting to fade. And so that's what gets us to the 9th inning, where it's a tied game. And in some of these races, I would, again, my years of following politics would tell me that, all right, in a tied anything, the tie goes to the runner, which in this case would be the Republican Party. But in this case, that wasn't what happened. It's actually the tie went to the Democrats because in these swing states, independent voters, swing voters said, you know what? It's like that person in the Arizona focus group. Maybe I don't really like what Democrats are doing, but I don't know that they're going to do as much harm. I'm less worried about the damage or the risk of voting for this Democrat than voting for a Republican who seems way out of step. And so I think that's the way to think about how this whole series of events came to get to this very close 9th inning. And then, of course, extra innings in Georgia because, of course,
extra innings.
Georgia.
What do they call that? Free baseball. Free baseball. So, because you and I talked a lot over the past, year and a half, and you've sat in some focus groups, and I'll just say, if you and I go back to that phase of Delta Afghanistan, one of the things that I was saying about the focus groups at the time was just like how wild the enthusiasm gap was, right? Like Republicans were still in like, this was stolen from us mode. They wanted to vote for any living, breathing Republican, didn't care who. That showed up at the Virginia races. McAuliffe was making it a referendum on Trump, which just was not working there. And there was this pent up energy around the grassroots Republicans in Virginia. And then you saw the independents break over a lot of local issues, that COVID, schools, things like that. What Dobbs did, and what I always try to say to people is like, what I saw Dobbs doing is it evened out the enthusiasm gap that was so disproportionate in favor of the Republicans. And I don't think it was like the kind of cosmic game changer. You don't see people in the streets, and it didn't create a massive blue wave or like a wild rejection. Like you said, it was sort of state to state, but it did even out the enthusiasm gap in a bunch of places where it really mattered, and probably overall. But then also, there was a real sense from people. So I do a lot in the democracy community, whatever that means. But, people who were concerned about all these election deniers, as I was, especially those running for governors and secretaries of state who were going to be in a position to certify elections. And it was a struggle for me because I could tell from all the focus groups that democracy was not something that people would say that mattered to them. I don't think there's ever been a swing focus group where someone's been like, oh, gas prices, the economy, crime, inflation, and democracy. Like, just never happens. And yet, I do think the January 6th committee mattered some in helping to raise the salience of some of the sort of election denialism. And just like crime fell on certain candidates in some ways, I also felt like the democracy stuff had hit these election deniers, Mark Fincham, Secretary of State candidate in Arizona, it hit Doug Mastriano, like people who were at January 6th, bus people to January 6th, ran on election denialism platforms, which ended up being a lot of the Republican candidates in these swing states, Gary Lake, for example. And so I actually think that democracy did kind of matter. There's also this Venn diagram of people who like are an extreme election denier is like a perfect circle with people who are extreme on abortion. And so that kind of came together to create a picture of a candidate that voters just thought was too crazy, that these swing voters and these independents just could not get there on because they were like, these people are nuts. And it wasn't because they had this like deep, enduring sense of democracy, but democracy was there, in my opinion. It was on the ballot. And sort of once the enthusiasm gap had been sort of evened out by abortion and Dobbs, you basically had a dogfight for these independent voters, a dogfight that Democrats won because of how bad the candidates were.
Right. Yes. And so without Dobbs, and I would say to your point, without Trump and January 6th, et cetera, in the mix, it would have probably looked a lot like November of 2021, like the Virginia governor's race, where you just didn't have as much enthusiasm on the Democratic side, and independents are more Republican-leaning independents. Is that what you are saying?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But I guess my question for you, my kind of closing question is like, where does this leave us? You know, like, is abortion something that is going to make a difference in enthusiasm and turnout for cycles to come? Are Republicans going to recalibrate away from these crazy candidates, knowing that while they are poison to independent voters and swing voters, they all got through their primaries, in part because Trump pulled them there, but also because base voters want them. And so where does this leave us now?
So I have been thinking about this a lot, and I think we're going to get kind of a preview of it in 2023 because the folks here in Virginia, where I am, we have off-year elections, and they're legislative elections in 2023. You have in Glenn Youngkin a governor who is talking about, we'll see what sort of abortion laws, et cetera, how that plays here, right? So even though Dobbs happened, everybody's moving forward, we know that so many of these states still have to go and either adjust the laws that are already on the books or perhaps put ballot initiative on for voters to vote on in 2024. So I do think this debate is going to continue. The other thing, Sarah, that I think a lot about is a great observation made by political scientist John Sides, who's at Vanderbilt, and his colleagues wrote a book called The Bitter End, which is review of the 2020 election. And their point is we are now so deeply polarized that we've become completely calcified. The races that moved in this election were ones that were already right on the edge, right? So they're purple states in the presidential, or they were purple districts in the last election. So those were the only places that moved from red to blue or blue to red. Everything else stayed exactly the same. The reds maybe got a little redder. The blues maybe got a little less blue because of turnout. But the bottom line is this is now not a bug, but a feature that we've now had, 2016, 2018, 2020, 2022, the fight for control of the House and the Senate coming down to, and the presidency, of course, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 votes in just a handful of states and a handful of districts. So we're fighting over this very small pie, which would seem to make our politics more predictable because it's not as if we're seeing these big sea changes, right? Oh my gosh. I mean, we do have sometimes a surprise. Lauren Boebert could lose. But other than that, nothing is surprising, but everything's surprising because all it takes is 3 Senate seats moving toward Democrats at the end. Boom, there we go. Democrats now have control of the Senate. And you're right, the Dobbs decision helping to motivate Democrats. But as we said, it didn't help Tim Ryan in Ohio, didn't help Sherry Beasley in North Carolina. So it is still those states that we're talking about, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan, and they are all that we're going to be talking about from now on.
We didn't even get to split ticket voters, which is another thing you and I both talked about a lot this cycle. I'm sorry.
We'll get to it. We've got plenty of time.
We got plenty of time. As my friend JVL would say, good show, long show. Amy Walter, thank you so much for coming back for the 3rd time to the Focus Group podcast. It was so great to have you and talk through all of this. And thank you to all of you who have been with us all cycle. We are going to do one more episode. We're going to go down to Georgia one last time for this Georgia runoff. That will likely be our final episode of the season. So we're going to be back here next week. We're going to do this again. See you there. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Focus Group podcast. I'm Sarah Longwell, publisher of The Bulwark, and this week we've got Georgia on our minds because it is runoff time. So Republicans had a solid night in Georgia on November 8th. Governor Brian Kemp beat Stacey Abrams a second time, winning by around 7.5 points. Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, a personal favorite of mine, got reelected by around 9 points. And then there's Herschel Walker, whose controversies we discussed at length in the last Georgia episode with Time reporter Molly Ball. He could only pull in about 48.5% of the vote. So this focus group that we did was super interesting. Most of the group voted for Herschel Walker, but for one reason or another, when we did our screener to find people, they screened as on the fence about the runoff, so undecided. I'll also add that this entire group voted for Donald Trump in 2016, and all but 2 voted for him in 2020. Now, my guest today is Greg Bluestein, political reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the author of the book Flipped: How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Power. Greg, thanks for being here. I'm so excited to have you.
Oh, I'm honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
So one of the things that has been just like great fun on this podcast is I've gotten to have sort of the John Ralston, the people who are like the political person from the state to listen to the groups. And you're that person there in Georgia, which has become such an important state in the political conversation. But so what are you doing right now as we head into this runoff?
So we're taping this on the Friday before the runoff. And this is the peek behind the curtains for reporters. I am spending the day finishing my prep for next week. So not only do we have to have stories saying Walker won or Warnock won, but we also have to start our why they won or why they lost type stories as well. So I finished up the 2 big prep stories about just so we're ready for if either scenario happens. And hopefully there will be a scenario. Hopefully it won't be this long drawn out legal battle over ballots. I don't even want to jinx us. And then I next have to go to write the why they won type stories.
I talked to lots of reporters who are working on pre-writes, but pre-writing the why has got to be interesting. Like, do you have a theory of the case of why either one of them could win in advance? Like, you already have that theory?
Yeah. I mean, look, things right now at least seem like they're tilting pretty decisively in Warnock's favor. Your last episode, you mentioned a lot of the issues that Herschel Walker's having and a lot of the things that are playing into Warnock's camp. I think one of the biggest issues is kind of what we're hearing from this focus group that we're about to talk about. But the split ticket voters, the Kemp Warnock voters are signaling, at least it's impossible to know, but I've just done tons of interviews with them, and many of them are, at least they tell me, they're going back out to vote for Warnock once again. But in this focus group, you also have even Walker supporters who are worried about going back out to the runoff for him. So, that'll be part of the why, if Warnock does end up winning, why he won. But of course, there's also all sorts of issues that have plagued Walker's campaign throughout this entire election season that are even getting worse in some ways. Republicans here were baffled that Herschel Walker was off the campaign trail for 5 full days doing Thanksgiving break at the same time when Senator Warnock had more than a dozen events, and he tried to drum up early voting over the weekend before the last week of early voting. So there's been just inexplicable gaffes. There's been great ads from the Warnock campaign. They're outspending Walker nearly 3-1 right now in Georgia. There's just a lot of things that are tilting into the Democrats' favor. But at the same time, you never know with these runoffs, and so Herschel Walker could pull off a stunning upset.
So before we jump in to this, I just want to ask you, like, as a reporter, so after the 2018 governor's race, the 2020 presidential election, those like 2020 Senate runoffs that cost the GDP of like a small island nation, and then like another crazy cycle in 2022, Georgia's got to be the most exhausting place in America to cover politics. And you are the most, like, you're the biggest political reporter in the state. What is your life like?
It's busy. My family's ready for Tuesday. I'm ready for Tuesday, but they also we're kind of used to us. And, frankly, this might sound crazy, but I bring my kids on the campaign trail with me to events. So I've got a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old. They've met all the candidates. In fact, in the 2020 runoffs, they interviewed all the candidates for what they call Bluestein blogs. So they got to interview John Ossoff, Raphael Warnock, David Perdue, Kelly Loeffler. So they get to see a fun side of the campaign trail because I bring them up to events in small towns or events with free donuts with free food. So we bond sometimes on the campaign trail. I'm lucky at the AJC, we have a big team as well, so I don't have to be at every single event. I can take a day like I am today and work on enterprise, work on other stories. But also, as you know, once the election's over, our work is not done. We've got to write, what's next.
Yeah.
We got to cover the legislative session. We got to cover the less sexy things coming up in Georgia. So we have one eye on that. We have meetings about the year to come that are starting right after the runoff ends.
Well, I love your work, and I can tell, if you're a political junkie, obviously, I know it can be a lot, but it also sounds like it's a ton of fun. Love that you take your kids. All right, let's talk about this Senate race. So Warnock, as you pointed out, seems like he's in a pretty good position because Walker is just a lousy candidate in many ways. So this group that we talked to is a group that Walker should have locked up.
Mm-hmm.
To be where he wants to be. Yet several in this group are still sort of teetering on the brink of indecision. Let's listen.
What I have done, and I didn't do as much beforehand because I knew I was going to go with Kemp and I was going to go Republican. But ever since this happened, and then you see all the negative ads, I've done my research. I've read up on Warnock. I read up on Herschel Walker. And, obviously both have their flaws. There's no doubt about it. So do I. I personally think the biggest issue right now is crime, and who is going to do the best for us to take care of some of the crime in Georgia and Atlanta and that sort of thing. And I do think that Walker's leaning a little more that way for me.
I voted conservative the first time for Walker, almost for default value. To me, the more important issue was crime, and I felt he would be a stronger candidate. I voted for Kemp with no second thoughts about it. But the issue with Herschel is almost like the first time I voted for Trump. I voted for Trump the first time and I didn't the second time because after I saw him for a while, I just started having second doubts about it. And I admit I am being influenced by a lot of these television ads that they're putting on. Walker just comes off as such a buffoon sometimes, and yet if I look at the core values, I think he's more of a Republican candidate, but I'm really on the fence between the two of them. I'm not as worried. Of course, I'm not a woman, so it's easy for me to say that. I'm not as worried about the abortion issue because he seems to have such an extreme abortion issue that is not with rape, like you're saying, or any of those other situations that I don't think he can get that passed to that extreme. So I have a fundamental belief that will be moderated a great deal more.
So you just heard people and this group that they all voted for Kemp without a second thought. Mm-hmm. Many of them really liked Kemp. So it seems like a generic-ish Republican would still do really well in Georgia. And so are Republicans in the state learning a lesson from Walker?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we did a group. Sounds like you listened to it of it was a group of swing voters and they were 100% Kemp, Warnock. Mm-hmm, there was one guy who wasn't going to go for Warnock and even he was kind of on the fence about it. And so do you think there's any lessons being learned here after these last couple cycles and seeing Walker struggle? Yeah, tell me about it.
Yeah, and first off, I mean, those Kemp Warnock voters were the decisive factor in the midterm. They were the difference between Republican outright victories in every statewide contest, except for this one, where it was driven to a runoff because Senator Warnock was able to attract a significant number of these crossover voters. 200,000 fewer people voted for Herschel Walker than Governor Brian Kemp. So that kind of says it all right there. And this focus group is so remarkable because there's no talk from Democratic supporters of Senator Warnock in the first round of saying, oh, well, we're worried about voting for the second round because we're worried about his history or his background. There's none of that. The bigger issue for the Democrats is just getting them back out to the polls, not about convincing them another time to vote. But meanwhile, as we heard, even Herschel Walker supporters, like the second gentleman we just heard, are concerned about voting for him. And they're being swayed by these TV ads. And more than $300 million has been spent on TV ads in Georgia. $80 million has been spent doing the runoffs on TV ads. So they're having an impact on at least some voters. And it's just remarkable that even Walker supporters are now having second doubts. Even supporters who voted for him despite the history of violence, the erratic behavior, the lies on the campaign trail, the abortion allegations, you name it. They still held their nose and voted for him in November. And now some of these voters are still on the fence about voting for him in December.
We're going to delve into that just a little bit more. But first, we're going to play a kind of a long section, but I want to give you a real sense. This group was so good.
It was.
And when I say good, I guess I mean they've clearly been marinating in this race for like such a long time. They were just incredibly clear in being able to articulate how they were thinking about things, what was making them stick with Walker if they were, and how they were rationalizing it. Like, so the critical mass of the group, right? So the people who don't think that Herschel is a good candidate, but they're doing the thing that should be a drinking game on the Focus Group podcast, which is just the lesser of two evils. But I want you to hear how these very conflicted voters are thinking about Walker and how they're getting there with him.
I want to counter the Democrat control and pull the lever at this point for Walker now, just because it is a numbers game. And so while I don't think he's the sharpest knife in the drawer, there are an awful lot of folks in Congress who are not terribly bright, quite frankly, some of them from this state. So I can't really hold that against him, per se. I can't really hold hypocrisy or lying against him because they all do it. So it really does get down, from my perspective, to trying to at least get a better balance of power in there and trying to at least get more bipartisanship, if that's even possible in this day and age, which it certainly doesn't seem like it now. But at least if you have a 50-50 Senate, somebody's got to go over to the other side, or unless it's a one vote decision by the VP. So that's kind of my stance on why I'm going to go ahead and vote for Herschel.
It's the big picture of control of the Senate, and Warnock will be in there for 6 years. So on the 2024 election, he'll already have that seat for another 4 years. I'm probably in the minority of a pro-choice Republican, but with the overturning of the Supreme Court of the Roe versus Wade, it's now at the state level. It's the state legislature, the state Senate, it's our governor that makes the decision now. All the states make the decision on abortion. I mean, what Warnock or Walker's opinion is on abortion really doesn't matter. We're not going to have a federal law or any kind of federal deal on abortion. It's just not going to happen. Walker is a horrible candidate. And I'm not just saying that as a Tennessee fan, but, he was a terrible candidate. And there's no doubt about it. Warnock is horrible too. He's been a terrible senator. So you just got to look at the big picture and say, hey, you want to have, the Democrats at 51-49 makes a big difference in 50-50. So that's why I decided to vote for Walker.
I think it's crucial that we have 50-50. And to be honest with you, 2 weeks ago, I was considering not even voting because I kept hearing things on the news when they were saying, so-and-so won and this one won. And then they said, well, there's no point now. It doesn't matter if Herschel wins or not, because even if he does, the Republicans still won't win the Senate. But if he wins, we will at least have half-half. And that, to me, is crucial. I don't like either candidate. I really don't like Herschel in these last 2 weeks. I think the ads that they've been showing have been just awful. He just looks like a buffoon, but I'm going to vote for him. And Jim, you saying that about the 50-50, that really struck a chord with me. So I will definitely be voting for Herschel. I don't want to, but I'm going to.
Man. And that was very, we don't play all of them, but I would say that was for the people who were going to vote for Walker, and not all of them are in this group. We'll get to that. They basically were like taking Walker out of it almost entirely and really just talking about control of the Senate. But I got to say, so this group seems to think that there's a marginal benefit to the extra Republican seat, even with no majority on the line. And so our listeners may recall that in the 2020 runoffs, the Senate majority was on the line. So how do you think the enthusiasm is different from 2021 when people were highly engaged, but enough of them didn't turn out because, they thought the election was stolen or whatever happened? I guess I was surprised to hear them have this rationale about the 50-50 mattering, because I thought that was kind of be off the table. So anyway, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I love, by the way, she's like, he's a buffoon, but I'm still going to vote for him. And we hear that all the time.
All the
right?
time.
We heard that throughout the first phase of the election. We heard that in the primary, even Republicans saying, hey, I don't necessarily like him. I don't like what he's saying. I don't like his history. I don't like his lies, his exaggerations, but I'm still going to vote for him because he's a Republican vote. And we certainly heard that in the context of Donald Trump in 16 and 20 here in Georgia and elsewhere. But it struck me as interesting that these are obviously well-versed voters who are paying attention to the narrative and they're paying attention to the news, because, the conventional wisdom was the moment that Senate control wasn't at stake, that would help Senator Warnock. And I still think it does, right? Because it takes away that core argument from Walker's allies that, hey, a vote for him was a vote for Republican control of the Senate. And now that Democrats will have the majority with the tie-breaking vote no matter what, but these voters are saying, hey, it's still important to get it back to 50-50. And some of them are paying attention enough to say, yeah, it means a different sort of power sharing agreement in the Senate. It makes it harder for Joe Biden to press his agenda. It makes it harder for him to get his presidential appointments through. It puts Republicans one vote closer to flipping back control of the chamber. So it's interesting hearing them articulate that, because I've certainly heard strategists talk about, hey, the stakes are still high. I've heard Democrats, frankly, say the same thing to try to not take the wind out of their sails, saying, hey, this gives us wiggle room in case Joe Manchin defects or Kirsten Sinema votes against a key policy. So it still shows that, hey, the stakes are still very high here, if not as high as they were in 2021 when Senate control was on the line.
I was really blown away by how deep that was with them in terms of a rationalization. I got to say, the one thing that I thought was interesting is the way that they talked about Herschel as a buffoon, right? So they think that he's obviously not a talented politician, et cetera. But the ads are about him holding a gun to his ex-wife's head. It is his son saying that he threatened their lives and they had to move. It's weird to me that the takeaway is Walker's a buffoon versus
he's dangerous or something.
Yeah, that's right. They don't seem to be convinced of the danger side of it. Why do you think that is? Because the ads are, I think, quite effective.
Well, when you have as much money as Senator Warnock, you can push all sorts of ads. So yes, we have seen ads literally just focusing on his ex-wife's, very compelling testimony about his violent threats against her. But we've also seen ads, and very effective ads, of just Herschel Walker on the campaign trail saying bizarre things about bad air from China, about vampires against werewolves, about we have enough trees on Earth already. Why are we worried about climate change? Things like that have created memes. They've gotten a different level of notoriety for Herschel Walker than just the violence and, misstatements he's made on the campaign trail. So I think that's where she's going with the whole buffoon statement, because it's hard to turn on a TV in Georgia right now without seeing one of those ads that literally just put Herschel Walker using his own words against him. And that's been a core argument for Senator Warnock's campaign throughout. They weren't necessarily seizing on the violence at first. They weren't necessarily seizing on these abortion allegations that we've talked about. Instead, they've just said, hey, he's unfit for U.S. Senate because he's not a serious candidate. And then they've highlighted the remarks he's made about COVID sprays that inoculate you from COVID. Things like that from the very get-go of his campaign kind of underscored their argument.
When I started doing the focus groups in Georgia, a long time ago, going into the primaries, when I was just trying to get a handle on how voters felt about Herschel Walker, one of the things that struck me, because I was initially, when Trump was putting him forward and Mitch did go along with it, I was like, why? This guy can't string two sentences together. But then I started doing some focus groups in Georgia, and I was like, oh, these guys think he is a god. I remember one of my favorite comments in a focus group, and we talked about it on this podcast. We're talking to the group and we're saying, have you heard about him playing Russian roulette with himself? The fact that he would hold a loaded gun to his head and pull the trigger. And people were kind of hadn't heard of that. But somebody said, well, I guess Herschel keeps winning. That's what Herschel does. He wins. And I remember being like, oh man, the love for Herschel Walker is so deep in this state that it's sort of like with Trump was one of the things I really missed was how familiar people felt with him because of his television show. Mm-hmm. When I started doing focus groups with Trump voters, the number of people who'd watched his show and had a feeling of a personal connection to him, a comfort with him because he'd been in their living rooms for 8 years. I had just totally missed that element of it. But anyway, as all the buffoonery and all that stuff, has it really eroded just the warmth and good feeling for Walker in the state?
Oh, sure. And he had to know that. He had to know that half the state would end up or at least, a significant number of voters would end up hating him by the end of this, because he came into this with much higher approval ratings, right? I guess this can help put it in context. I grew up in Georgia to parents who could care less about football, didn't watch football, didn't care about UGA sports. And I still grew up hearing about the legend of Herschel Walker. When I saw him at an airport, I don't know, a half a decade ago, I dropped everything to go take a picture with him because he's this icon in Georgia. I know Democrats who named their dogs Herschel, whose garage codes are 3434 after his number, who say, and not jokingly, that had he run in a Democratic open primary for a statewide office, he probably would have won too, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's just his name brand appeal. You can't buy that sort of name ID. And then you add to that on the Republican side, Donald Trump's endorsement, later on Mitch McConnell's endorsement. It froze the field. Really good candidates like Attorney General Chris Carr or Congressman Buddy Carter said, I can't compete with that. They got out of the race early. In hindsight, they probably, I don't know if they could have won, but they would have had a much better standing against Senator Warnock for sure than Herschel Walker has. You wouldn't be talking about all these split ticket voters with candidates like that. But also Herschel Walker, he has this name ID you just cannot buy in Georgia. So he came in with this sort of legendary status that he used. And frankly, if you go back to the primary campaign, a lot of the issues we're talking about here, we talked about in Georgia since last August. His Texas residency, violence against women, bizarre statements. None of this is really new. There's been plenty that have come out since that have amplified those arguments and those concerns. But we've been talking about these same issues now for a year about Herschel Walker. Gary Black, his main Republican rival, even cut an ad saying this is what Democrats will use against Herschel Walker in November and October if he wins the primary. And Gary's ad was pretty much spot on. There have been a lot more that's been added to that, but the core arguments are spot on. And yet still, even knowing the baggage, even knowing the issues, Herschel Walker was unbeatable.
There's a CNN poll that has Warnock 52-48. But one of the things they talked about in it was how Warnock has basically completely locked up the black vote, that Herschel just isn't getting. And I guess I always thought that maybe Herschel would pick up more of the black vote. But obviously when things come down to turnout, talk to me about the black vote in Georgia, and then also your sense of enthusiasm, turnout. Was Stacey being on the ticket helpful for voter enthusiasm, or do you think Warnock will be better on his own?
Yeah, this was totally a theme of the midterm election because Senator Warnock was always polling pretty well with black voters, and pretty well means 90% plus, because to win in Georgia as a Democrat, you've got to block up the African-American base. That is the most important and reliable block of voters in Georgia for Democrats. And Stacey Abrams was the one lagging behind. She was in the 70s and low 80s at a time when Senator Warnock was double digits ahead of her in some of these polls. And it was very concerning to Stacey Abrams and her allies. And she had events specifically geared at black male voters. She tailored her message. She started talking about reparations and other issues that she thought would appeal to more black voters. And in the end, it really didn't matter, right? She lost, but she ended up consolidating the black voter base to a similar degree as Senator Warnock. And when you're going into this runoff, when it's all really about that base turnout, it's so important for him to continue to consolidate that black base. And the concerns you're hearing from black leaders here in Georgia about Herschel Walker isn't just that he's a Republican who supports a lot of far-right policies that they oppose, but also that he's being propped up by white Republicans. And images of Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham kind of sandwiching Herschel Walker in interviews on Fox News have played terribly with the African-American base. You've seen memes and tweets and press release events and all sorts of things from black voters saying that that's one of the biggest concerns they have with Herschel Walker, that essentially he'd be a tool of white Republicans. And he has not been able to counter that because, frankly, he's not responding to anything at all. Any of our questions, any media questions at all. He's done very few events. He's done very few interviews with outlets that are going to ask him any probing questions. Instead, he's really just kept to his same really, by now, predictable stump speech over and over again. And he's avoided even shouted questions for the press. He's putting up barriers 20 feet away from him so that press can't even get close enough to even shout a question at him, let alone ask him a question.
Wow. Well, I want to close this Senate race conversation, but then I've got more I want to talk to you about. But this last part, I want to play a couple of the people who are sort of right-leaning, Republican-oriented, but they're going to vote for Warnock. And I think this is the part of this group that should put a pit in the Walker campaign's stomach. Let's listen.
I actually did not vote in the general, but I am planning on voting on Tuesday. I don't really like either candidate whatsoever. Big fan of Kemp. He did a lot for teachers. I think he did a really solid job during his tenure. Right now I am leaning towards Warnock, I would say, primarily because the abortion law really scares me right now. And so that is pretty much my prime reason for leaning towards Warnock at the moment.
I am a Republican, and I tend to go right down the ballot, Republican, Republican, Republican. That's what I did the first time. 2 days ago, I said, I just can't do it. I don't want that person making decisions for me. No experience, holding a gun to your wife's head, lying, I almost feel like it's, well, we want to prevent abortions unless I impregnated them, then go ahead and do an abortion, We want to have more Republicans in the House than Democrats. That's probably one of the factors I was thinking of the first go round. But, after seeing the ads and doing a little research and influenced by my husband who was saying the same as me as, no, can't do it.
So this is incredible to me because you've got the first woman who did not vote the first time. She didn't come out. She was pox on both their houses. But now she has decided that specifically because of abortion, she's going to come out in the runoff and vote for Warnock. And then the second woman voted for Walker the first time, and at this point now had already early voted for Warnock. She has changed her mind because the first time it sounds like she just went straight ticket for Republicans. She's a Kemp fan. But the second time she's flipped and already voted for Warnock. And that to me is really wild.
Yeah. And again, someone who is reliably Republican. And again, that's the biggest factor to me in this race because it's so different from the 2021 runoff that Warnock won, where he just basically honed in on liberals and said, hey, if we can get the same base that we got out to back Joe Biden in November, we can win this runoff. And he didn't really focus on Kelly Loeffler. He didn't really focus on his Republican opponents. He just focused on his agenda. Where in this race, yeah, of course, he's highlighting the votes he made and he's highlighting his push to cap the price of insulin at $35 and such. But he's making this a contrast with him and Herschel Walker. And it's so effective because you're hearing again and again from these people that we just heard from this focus group are not anomalies. Out on the campaign trail, in my inbox, when I'm just going around town in Georgia, I hear all the time from Kemp Warnock voters who insist they're going to come back out to the polls. I was just talking to a senior Republican advisor here in Georgia who is noting that in Buckhead, which is a very wealthy neighborhood in North Atlanta, today on Friday, the last day of early voting, there are lines wrapping around the building. And I said, that is Kemp Warnock territory. And he goes, yep. And that's why we're so worried right now. I mean, just huge turnout in these areas of sort of mainstream Republican voters who just can't vote for Herschel Walker for whatever reason. And some of them are not going to vote at all. And some of them, as we heard, are going to go and hold their nose and cast their ballot for Raphael Warnock.
Yeah, can I just say, too, because several people mentioned abortion in this group, and that one woman who loved Kemp, even though he signed the heartbeat bill, but she, for abortion, totally disqualifies Herschel. And I think that this is so interesting on the abortion issue. It's like when they don't like somebody or they think somebody's extreme, like abortion is often their way in, and they want to like say abortion is this. But like if they like a candidate, like I think in Texas, you saw this with Abbott, you saw it with Ron DeSantis and with Kemp, they don't seem to let abortion be disqualifying for that candidate.
Yeah. And you heard from a few of these folks on this focus group who said, oh, wow, it's such a rare instance. And One of them didn't like Herschel Walker's call for a total ban on abortion, but said, oh, that will never pass, right? So they're sort of writing it off as a possibility. This is a race full of unbelievable divides between the candidates on policies. Abortion is one of many, but there's just staunch divides between them on healthcare, on guns, on crime, on, you name it. There's a big, huge chasm between them on issues. And it's one that, of course, Senator Warnock has played into. I mean, it's not the focus of his campaign message. Frankly, the focus of his campaign message has long been that appeal to those swing voters. They've identified, I'm talking about basically a year out, these swing ticket voters will be crucial to them, decisive to them. They've executed this campaign strategy to make it easier for these swing ticket voters to hold their nose and vote for Senator Warnock. The way he does that is he doesn't talk about Joe Biden on the campaign trail. Joe Biden's approval ratings in Georgia are about 40% in most polls. He's not talking about really polarizing issues. He's instead talking about how he can work with Ted Cruz on the campaign trail. He can work with Marco Rubio. And it's often to the shock of people in the crowds. I've seen jaws drop when he talks about working with Ted Cruz on a highway bill. And then he explains it saying, hey, this shows I can work with anyone, even Ted Cruz, if it means helping Georgia.
All right. Prediction time. Who do you think's going to win?
This is where I get in trouble. But look, I've talked to even many Republicans who say it'll be really, really difficult for Herschel Walker to win. And it's not just all these gaffes and these errors, but it's some stuff out of his control, right? Once Senate control was clinched by Democrats, that made Herschel Walker's case to these skeptical Republicans that much harder. There have been a lot of gaffes, even in the runoff period. There's been that misstep I talked about where he was off the campaign trail for 5 days. It was inexplicable. There's been a lot of campaign turmoil within the Walker campaign that has really complicated their effort to drive home a unifying message. And Senator Warnock hasn't had any of those issues. He's been free of infighting and controversy. And as you noted, he's been able to consolidate his base of support. And he has the resources to press his campaign. He's far outraised Herschel Walker in these final stretch. So the odds are definitely in Senator Warnock's favor. But the big caveat is that Election Day tends to go decisively for Republicans, right? Herschel Walker beat Senator Warnock on Election Day by double digits. And Republicans say there's still a path to victory. So while I'd give Senator Warnock the edge, he could very well win by 4 or 5 points right now. If there's a huge Election Day turnout, then all bets are off. But I don't know if we're going to see that. I don't sense the same enthusiasm for Herschel Walker out there that we see for Senator Warnock.
Yeah. Okay. I'm really sorry to do this to you, but
go for it.
We got to talk just a little bit about Trump 2024.
Sure, of course.
Because, we asked the group if they were excited to see Trump's announcement and nobody raised their hand. I really wanted to talk to hardcore Trump voters and see where they were on Trump. And so we did a different group earlier this week with 2-time Trump voters. And there was only one person in that group who was excited to see Trump running again. And then the rest were like, meh. And a couple were like, absolutely not. But in this one, we asked at the end, and to be clear, not everyone in this group voted for Trump in 2020. They all voted for him in 2016. A couple of them didn't in 20, but the two people you're about to hear did. So let's listen to them.
It's time to move on. Everybody feels you're not going to vote for an 80-year-old guy who only can go for 4 more years. It is time to move on. It's over. End of story.
He's just very divisive. I mean, people either hate the guy or love the guy. I mean, there's just no middle ground with Trump. And unfortunately, it seems the haters are far more. And candidly, I mean, he's a bit immature. I mean, he's a bit petulant sometimes. But who knows what it'd be like to be sluffering the slings and arrows he did for 4 years as president of the United States at the time. But I think it is time to move on. I want the candidate that has the best chance of winning, who brings common sense to the role, who is a little bit more polished, if you will.
So I got to say, Georgia,
yeah,
I've been fascinated by Georgia voters and their relationship with Trump, because everywhere else in this country, Trump got the primary candidates he wanted. But him primarying Kemp and even Brad Raffensperger, who underperformed Kemp by a lot but still got it done. What is the relationship with the voters and Trump in Georgia now? Because these people were not into him.
Trump's track record in Georgia was awful because it wasn't just Brian Kemp and Brad Raffensperger, who beat back Trump-backed challengers, but it was also the Attorney General, Chris Carr, and even the Insurance Commissioner, John King, beat basically an unknown Republican who based his entire campaign on Trump and accusing the Republican incumbent of woke insurance policies, which no one knew what the hell that meant. And then when you even say, look, Herschel Walker did have Trump's endorsement and blessing, but Herschel Walker did not need Trump's endorsement or blessing to win the Republican primary. I'm sure it helped with some voters, but we can't really put Herschel Walker in the same category as we put like Blake Masters and other national Republicans who got Trump's blessing, and it helped them emerge from obscurity into a legit contender, because Herschel Walker is Herschel Walker in Georgia. He had sky high name recognition and that UGA background I talked about earlier. But yeah, we have this unique relationship, our Republican Party, because even after Kemp easily defeated David Perdue, you could definitely look at that moment of him beating back Donald Trump's handpicked challenger and said that was the moment he unified the Republican Party, that Trump did Kemp a favor in a sense by doing this, because, Kemp had 95% of support in polls over the summer after he beat David Perdue from Republicans. So there was no sort of sense of the MAGA crowd turning against him and withholding their support from him against Stacey Abrams. So David Perdue helped Brian Kemp unify Republicans behind him by launching that ill-fated challenge. And going into this next 2024 cycle, we see a number of Republicans who want nothing to do with Donald Trump, starting with Brian Kemp. He withheld any criticism of Donald Trump throughout the primary and throughout the general election campaign because he didn't want to do anything to ostracize the former president and get him off the sidelines, because Trump was also pretty silent about Kemp through the general election campaign. But right after he won, he took a veiled shot at Donald Trump in his victory speech. And these guys got death threats. They got booed at Republican gatherings, all sorts of internal pushback because of Donald Trump's lies. So they are not going to bend over backwards and help Donald Trump. And many of their supporters feel the same way. And right now, Brian Kemp is the most popular Republican in Georgia. It's not Donald Trump by a long shot. And we see that with the fact that Donald Trump has not come to Georgia to rally for Herschel Walker. Instead, it's Brian Kemp who Herschel Walker wants at his side right now. So you've seen the narrative really flip. And I've seen internal polls that show Kemp's support among likely runoff voters is at 60%, whereas Trump's is at 30 or 35. So that tells you all you need to know. Do we count Donald Trump out? No, because we know that in a crowded primary field, even 30, 35% of support can do the trick. But it certainly was not this, game-changing moment a few weeks ago when Donald Trump announced his comeback bid. Most Republicans were kind of like, okay, what's next?
Totally. And I'll tell you, speaking of what's next, Ron DeSantis has been having like a big moment in the focus groups for like a while now. Yeah. We can't find anybody to say a bad thing about him. And so we asked this group if they would prefer DeSantis or Trump in a primary, and it was a clean sweep for DeSantis. And everybody you're about to hear is a 2-time Trump voter.
There are people that will vote for Ron DeSantis that won't vote for Donald Trump. And that's the bottom line for me.
In our neighborhood, there are already signs for DeSantis for president.
He does what he says he's going to do. From living in Florida for 4 years, I just thought he was fantastic. Mm-hmm. And I just thought he governed with the people in mind more so than anybody I see now. I just thought he was fantastic.
So here's the thing that shocked me about this group. We asked them about 2024. And they all started talking about DeSantis. We ran through some names. Yeah, Pence, Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, and everybody was kind of like, Nobody said Brian Kemp.
Yeah.
I was wondering that
too.
Kemp.
I was wondering.
I wish we'd asked. We didn't ask explicitly. We were just freewheeling.
Sure.
I just can't believe that nobody brought him up. What is going on? Why is DeSantis like really just that much in people's brains that they don't realize in Georgia they've got their own successful governor who beat a much tougher opponent than Ron DeSantis did down in Florida?
So it's funny. I asked one of Kemp's key aides about this. Right after he won the election, he went to the RGA, Republican Governors Association. And, I said, what was the reaction? He said, he got a hero's welcome. But the same aide said, but DeSantis was like in a different stratosphere. I mean, the guy won in what was used to be a swing state by 20 points. Kemp won by 8 points, so it's nothing to sneeze at against Stacey Abrams. But DeSantis won by like a literal landslide. And I just think, look, Kemp is starting his second term. He is definitely a national figure now. There's no doubt about that. And I think he'll definitely be looked at as a potential running mate for one of those non-Trump candidates. And he'll even be talked about as a 2024 candidate. It's not something he's shying away from because it certainly helps his profile. But I think internally, it's not something that's also being seriously talked about. Instead, I think he's going to be vetted as a potential running mate, and maybe he'll become a running mate. Who knows? But I think also he's seriously looking at a Senate run in 2026, which is a whole different can of worms. But certainly, Kemp, look, he beat Donald Trump and he beat Stacey Abrams in the same election cycle. And Stacey Abrams is the arch nemesis to not just a lot of Georgia Republicans, but a lot of national Republicans too. So coming off of that sort of election cycle, he's definitely seen as a 2024 player. I just don't think a lot of folks in Georgia right now see him that way. And it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out the next 2 years as the jockeying really intensifies for 2024.
Yeah, it will be, especially because I have very serious doubts about the political talent of Ron DeSantis. The enthusiasm for him in the focus groups, which is super real and off the charts, it's also quite shallow.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they saw him yelling at kids in masks on a YouTube clip, and then they saw him yelling at Disney, and they know he did a good job with COVID. And obviously he's done it in this big bombastic way that the media has paid a ton of attention to. And Kemp, he also kept things open on COVID and bucked the national trends there. He took on Major League Baseball. He took on Coca-Cola over the voting bill. And maybe you could tell me, because I haven't watched him up close as much. He's a pretty smooth guy. Like what's your evaluation of, I guess, his political talent?
Yeah. So one of the biggest things he's got going for him is he's tireless. He loves being out there. He loves going to events. Even when he was getting booed at Republican gatherings, he would sit there for hours before and hours after and take every single question about Donald Trump's election lies and whatever it might come from like angry people holding signs calling for his head. And sometimes his aides and his wife didn't like the fact that he was so willing to do that. But that's who Kemp is. And secondly, he's very on message. I mean, one thing that got Stacey Abrams is she would speak off the cuff a lot and sometimes get herself in trouble. And Governor Kemp, you could ask different variations of questions about Donald Trump and he'd give the same answer 50 times. And he was very good at that. And even interviews we're seeing with national broadcasters this week about whether or not he wants to run in 2024, right? They're asking him that question. He says the same thing over and over again, which is our focus needs to be on Herschel Walker, and I'm not even thinking about 2024. And he says variations of that time and time again. So he's got that going for him. He's not this sort of magnetic personality. He doesn't have a cult of personality around him. He's good on the stump, but he's not going to bring tears to your eyes. He's not a magnetic speaker. What he does have is he's very good strategically, and he can kind of see around corners. And that helps him a lot. He knew at a time when folks like me had no idea. I was scared to death, frankly, when he reopened the economy early in the pandemic. Even the hardcore conservatives were still living in their basements, right? It was weeks into the pandemic, and he allowed barbers and bowling alleys to reopen. And people like me were writing, oh my God, this is going to be the biggest test of Brian Kemp's administration. And he knew that would be a defining moment for him, and knew to run his campaign with that as one of its central messages. And guess what? It worked, right? It worked for him. He has really good political instincts. My gut still tells me that his political instincts will not take him to the White House in 2024. Like, he won't run. I think, he's going to end up being much more focused on a second term as Georgia's governor and at helping other Republicans. But Mike Pence and him are very close. If you go back to Mike Pence's first big break with Donald Trump, what was it? It was endorsing Brian Kemp right before the primary and coming to Georgia and having a big rally for Brian Kemp just days before the May vote earlier this year. So I will not be shocked to hear Mike Pence talking about Brian Kemp as a potential running mate in a few months.
Interesting. Greg Bluestein, I loved having you on. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us about the ins and outs of one of the most important states right now. This was awesome. And thanks to all of you. Guys, I'm sorry to tell you, but I think this is our last episode for the year. I won't promise it. Sometimes I can't help myself, but we've had a great year, great election cycle. The focus groups were always right, told us what we needed to know, but I really appreciate all of you listening and coming on this journey with us. And unless I break down, I will see you next year. Bye.